The shovel rang so sharply it felt like a note struck inside her teeth. Safamir froze on the ladder, mud slick on her palms, breath held on the lip of a prayer she didn't quite believe in anymore. Harlan Pike, broad-shouldered, sunburned, and already angry at the stubborn Clay, stared down into the waist-deep pit as if the ground had insulted his mother. The sound hadn't been the music of stone on stone. It had been cleaner, brighter. Metal. "Tell me you hit a river," Safa said, voice low, dry as the dust on her tongue. "River?" Harlan snorted, jamming the shovel in again. "Ma'am, what I hit is my patience." The shovel kissed that same hidden thing and sang once more, a bright bell swallowed by the earth. Harlan's eyes flicked to hers. Safa felt the world contract to the circle of shadow at the bottom of her yard, the white, unpainted farmhouse behind her, the fence posts leaning like tired men, the field beyond rib-caged with last year's stubble, and this hole, this stubborn, thirsty hole that had eaten 2 days' labor and given back only this note. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The afternoon pulled heat off the dirt and shimmering ropes. A hawk wrote lazy cursive above the lone poplar. 2 miles off, the highway murmured like an unkind memory. Safa took the crowbar from the tool bucket, the metal so hot it bit her palm, and stepped down past Harlan to the bottom. She crouched, ear close to the earth, breath steadying. The ground was compacted clay layered over gravel, she could smell the mineral cold in it. She moved the shovel aside and scraped with the crowbar, clay skimmed away, unveiling not the paleness of limestone but a dull disk, grit-filmed, near the color of the earth that hid it. It had been made to vanish. Harlan whistled, a thin, surprised sound. "What the hell?" "Not hell," Safa murmured, prying a little more. "A lid. A round of iron or steel, she couldn't tell yet, about the span of a barrel head. The edge was beveled, and in the faint groove a generation's worth of dust had settled into a dark vein. 2 bolt holes showed at opposite sides, the bolts sheared off long ago. In the center, a flattened ring handle lay flush, welded there, the welds blunted smooth. No maker's marks. No numbers. Its plainness, like a lie practiced too well, pricked the nape of her neck. Harlan spat into the dry grass and wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist. "Old septic?" "Septic lids are concrete," she said automatically. "And there's no line maps for any tank out here." She would know, she'd spent the last month learning the property's original permits by flashlight and stubbornness. Her grandfather's name, Dudmere, was a looping script on brittle forms that smelled of mildew and tobacco. He'd left her the farmhouse and the 3 acres like a dare. He'd left her the debts like a weather system. Under her knee, the metal's chill bled through clay to bone. She levered at the ring. It didn't budge. "Give me the pick." He handed it down. Harlan worked for cash in silence. His handshake had been one of those heavy, unsmiling grips that said, "I'll show up if the money's real." She'd scraped enough together by selling her camera and the vintage amp the band never used anymore. The thought left a bruise of a smile on her mouth. What had she traded? A sound for another sound. Strings and tubes for a note in the ground. She set the pick between earth and rim, tested the give. The lid gave nothing back. Whoever said it had meant it to matter for longer than the people who would forget it. Harlan wiped his neck with a rag and shifted his weight. "You want me to call county?" "Later." Safa steadied the pick with both hands, felt the tendons in her forearms tighten. The iron bit in with a stubborn squeal. She rocked the shaft and earned a grudging creak. The ring twitched a 1/4 inch. Cool air breathed up, tasting of pennies. Harlan took a step back as if the hole had raised a rattlesnake. "Nope." "Afraid of treasure?" She meant it as a tease and it came out as hunger. "Ma'am, I'm afraid of everything that ain't on the invoice." He held out a palm. "I'll take the day and leave you the tools." "You want me back in the morning?" Safa studied the disc, the ring, the seam. She thought of the faucet in her kitchen coughing out a rust color like old tea. She thought of the mortgage grace period that wasn't a period so much as a pianissimo rest before the next blow. She thought, with a sting she didn't let show, of the message left unread on her phone from a number that used to be love and had been reduced to logistics. "Finish the trench from the tank pad to the house," she said. "After that, we'll see." He hesitated, eyes sliding back to the glinting circle. "Lady, I don't mind weird. But I don't do unlucky." "Lucky is just weird." "That worked," she said, and levered again. By late afternoon, the lid turned in its throat. Dust and clay fell in narrow avalanches. The ring's hinge screamed softly like something being woken gently and against its will. When it lifted, they both smelled the breath that came up out of the dark, old water, cold iron, and something faint like dry paper. Harlan swore with professional respect. He bent, then flinched back. "That ain't a tank." Safa got her headlamp from the bucket, clicked it on, and leaned in. A shaft, cut clean, maybe 4 feet across. The inner walls were pipe-ringed, rivets marching in a faint spiral. Rungs, equally spaced, dropped into square shadow. About 8 feet down, the light struck another plane, the glint of another lid, or a floor, or a hatch with corners. She loved the word corners. It meant shape. It meant someone had intended this. "Army?" Harlan ventured. "Fallout, maybe?" He made it sound like gossip from the feed store. "Civil defense shelters were poured concrete," she said. "And you don't climb into those. You huddle." Her grandfather had told stories about the sirens in '62, about how the sky felt like a held breath for a month, about the way the men drank while making jokes about canned peaches and God. She'd laughed at 10 and stopped laughing at 12 when she learned what men laughed at to survive. Harlan was already inching the lid back into place with his boot. "Listen, Ms. Meir, I'm going to take my 50 in." "75, she said. He blinked. She pulled cash from the zippered pocket sewn into her work pants, counted into his hand, and met his eyes. "You weren't here. The well is just a hole that didn't work out. And if anyone asks, you think I'll put in a cistern instead." He closed his fist around the money with a speed that said he hadn't expected it. "Fine by me." He glanced once more at the ring, as if it might make an offer of its own, then backed out of the pit. "You're going to climb down there, ain't you?" "Not yet." She watched him go, the truck coughing itself to life, the gravel of the driveway popping under the tires. When the sound faded into the afternoon's long quiet, she looked at the empty fields and the stand of cottonwood down past the fence and felt two things at once: how alone she was and how not alone this land had always been. She fixed the lid open with the crowbar hooked under the ring and the other end chained to a rebar stake she'd hammered into the clay. The safety was a nod to common sense more than a belief that common sense would have any say in what came next. She tied the rope ladder she'd bought for the well to the upper rung and tugged it until it held. When she climbed, she did it on steadied breath, one rung at a time, like counting beads. Her headlamp found the second lid. This one was square, about 3 feet by 3 feet, with a heavy wheel in its center. She reached, and thought better. She climbed back up to the surface, pulled the ladder after her, and shut the round lid. The sound it made when it settled was closer to a swallowed clock than a door. It sent a small thrill, a guilt, a greed, through her. She set both palms on the warm iron. "You waited," she told it. "I'll be back before anyone else learns your name." Her phone buzzed. She pulled it out, thumb already braced for the familiar subtitle, "Missed call, Cameron." But the screen was blank of him. A fresh message instead, from a number with a county prefix. "Water Resource Permit Review, will be out tomorrow to confirm location. Please reply yes to confirm access." The timing was too neat. Safa stared at the iron circle, then at the fence line, then at the long ribbon of blacktop far off. She set the phone to silent and slid it back into her pocket. "No visitors," she said softly. "Not yet." She spent the next hour finishing the trench in the hard light, sweat mapping clean lines down the dust on her skin. She kept seeing that second lid, the wheel, the 4 corners, the promise of a room. If it was a room. If it was anything but a mood's trick. When the sun leaned west, she covered the round lid with 3 sheets of plywood and 8 cinder blocks, as if disguising a mouth with teeth. She stowed the most obvious tools in the kitchen and the rest in the lean-to that thumped in any wind. Then she went inside and drank 2 tall glasses of the water she'd driven in jugs from town, trying not to taste the plastic. A breeze pressed the lace at the kitchen window up and then let it fall. On the table lay Dudmere's knife, the one he used to open feed sacks he couldn't lift anymore. The old man had been all edges, all hands, a body that had believed in work long after his heart didn't. It had quit in a chair by that same window, not an arm's length from the ledger where he'd played chess on paper with the credit union. "You could have told me about the mouth in the yard, Dottie," she said. She'd always used the Punjabi word when she teased him. He'd hated its softness and loved that she insisted. She waited for the walls to answer. They sighed like old wood does. She ate from a skillet, eggs, onions, the last of the tomatoes she'd found sweet on the neighbor's honesty table, and smiled a little at the absurdity of this, a woman alone on a dying farm with a secret door to something in her dirt. The smile felt like a sheet over a mirror. At dusk, a white pickup nosed into her drive and stopped near the gate. It wore a magnetic county seal on its door like a costume pinned crooked. 2 men got out, one in a polo, office pail, a tablet cradled like a newborn, the other in a ball cap, boots scuffed, a jaw that had learned to clench early and never forgot. Safa wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped onto the porch. "Ms. Mir," the polo said brightly, as if this were a doorstep census and not a trespass. "Cade with Water Resources. Saw your permit application move to review. Figured we'd." "You texted me," she said. "For tomorrow. We were in the area." His smile was money. He lingered at the gate as if waiting for an invitation that would make the crossing legal. The man in the cap wasn't waiting, his gaze had already stepped over her shoulder and walked the yard. "What area?" Safa asked, not moving off the top step. "The area where you ignore appointments?" "Ma'am, drought's got us juggling," the cap said without the courtesy of introduction. "Farms trying illegal pulls. Barn wells drilling on old aquifers. We see fresh trenches, we check 'em." His eyes flicked to the plywood and the cinder blocks like a dog clocking a bone under a rug. "Then check the highway," Safa said evenly. "All the straw blooming there is someone else's fight. The trench is for a cistern I haven't bought yet." She let her gaze rest on the county seal on the truck door. The magnet had a thumb crease in it where someone had peeled it off and slapped it back on. "You're late for whatever you're early for." Cade's smile thinned. "We don't need an attitude, Ms. Mir. We do, however, need to verify you have no unauthorized taps. We can get a warrant if." "Get one," she said. "The judge who signs it lives 2 houses down and eats my neighbor's peaches." The man in the cap finally smiled, only with his eyes. "You from here?" he asked, tone like a challenge. Safa's throat felt full and hollow at once. "I am now." The men looked at each other. Cade recalibrated his brightness. "Tomorrow then," he said, and took a step back to the truck. The man in the cap took a step that wasn't back. That's when Safa recognized him, Kellen Roebuck. His family ran drilling rigs and roomers. They didn't show up with county. They showed up when something worth showing up for might be buried. Kellen tipped the brim of his cap. "Owe your granddad a debt for letting my dad hunt on that back field when he was little." "Then honor it," Safa said. "Stay off my dirt." The men left with the unhurried haste of people who didn't like being told no but had already decided the return time. Her heart was a slow drum against her ribs. In the almost dark, she moved the plywood again, not because hiding would hide anything but because she wanted her palms on that lid before anyone else's were. She wanted to be first in and last out. She wanted, for once, the story to belong to her first. Night made a black cup of the yard. The world in that hour went quiet in a way that wasn't silence, it was breath held by stars. She clicked on the headlamp, set the ladder, untied the safety chain, and eased the lid wide enough to slip through. The coolness that rose tasted like cellar and snowmelt. She descended into her own pulse. The square hatch below was painted once, but the color had faded to the idea of green. The wheel was stiff. She put her shoulder beneath it and felt the muscle thread and sing. The lock gave after a startled grunt. The hatch opened on a short throat of space and then a room. Her light slid over walls lined with shelves. On them, tins, glass jars, crates stenciled with letters so ghosted she had to trace them with her beam to read: salt, meal, water, potable. A black radio sat on a table near the far wall, its dials fat as knuckles, its face a rectangle of tiny teeth. A coil of wire hung like a sleeping snake from a hook in the ceiling. 2 cots waited beneath rough wool blankets the color of army nights. Between them, a lamp, glass bell, wick turned low, oil long ago turned to varnish. Safa felt laughter kick in her chest and flatten into something like awe. Not a septic. Not a cistern. A shelter, yes, but not concrete, not catalog. Built by hand with a stubbornness she recognized as kin. The air was cold enough to pinch. Her beam caught a calendar thumbtacked to a post, September 1967. A red pencil circled the 16th. In the corner, a wooden chest the size of a bathtub crouched beneath a tarp. Her mouth went dry in a new way. She crossed to the chest, set both hands on the rim, and pulled the tarp aside. The wood was dark, oak maybe, iron-banded. A lock the size of a child's fist guarded it. Safa tested it with her knuckles and listened to the echo. Empty? No. Full of what? She stood, scanned the room again, found, near the radio, a key ring on a nail. 3 keys hung there. One of them, square-headed, looked like it had been waiting for this lock all its life. She tried it. It turned. The lock side opened like a door in a memory. She lifted the lid. Inside, bundles wrapped in oilcloth, a metal document tube with threaded ends, a canvas pouch that clinked. A smell like old libraries rose and filled her lungs until she had to remind her ribs to move. She peeled a bundle. Letters. The top one addressed in a script she knew so bone-deep she felt the hairs on her arms lift, Dud. Her grandfather's name. The return name, in smaller letters at the top left, are Hale. The same surname as the faded street marker at the junction near the feed store, Hale Road, leading into the old orchards gone to thistle. Safa sat on the nearest cot and broke the seal with thumb and nail. Paper rasped, whispering where fingers had once learned each other's shapes. She read by headlamp, chest tight and wide at once. Dud. They asked me again about the shipments. I told them I lost everything in the fire. That lie's going to take root and I want it on a place where it won't get me killed. I put the rest where we buried the pipe. If you're reading this, then either we needed it and it saved us or we're gone and it didn't. Either way, you tell the truth to the one who comes next or you leave this shut forever. You know which I want. R. Shipments. Pipe. The one who comes next. Safa folded the letter with the care you use for bones, slid it back into oilcloth, and set it in the chest. The metal tube felt heavy in a way that said maps. The canvas pouch felt heavy in a way that said coin. She didn't open either. Not yet. A good story takes its breath where it can or it dies of too much air. She took in every corner then, the water carboys in the back nook, still sealed with wax, the bucket toilet with a lid and a bag of lime labeled like a kindness, the shelf of books, agriculture pamphlets, radio codes, a dog-eared Urdu translation of The Old Man and the Sea, and, tucked between, a cigar box with a paper band, mirror. She touched the lid as if it might be warm with her grandfather's hand. Inside, a photograph, Dud younger, laughing, a woman at his side with a scarf loose around her neck, her eyes made of light. On the back of the photo a scrawl, Hale's Orchard, the day we made the pipe disappear. Below the photo, a flat key unlike the ones on the nail and a single sentence on an index card, printed steady, if you take this, you promise to finish it. Safa lifted the key. It was lighter than it looked. Promise to whom? Finish what? She didn't know and the not knowing shrugged a new, dangerous wanting onto her back. She set the key in her breast pocket and felt its thin surety against her heart. A click. Above her. Her head snapped up. The square hatch sat open. The round lid, she had left it thrown back, she was sure, made a dark rim up into the shaft. Now the rim narrowed. The shaft's glow dimmed. The round lid eased toward closed, not like something caught by a wind that didn't reach this deep, but like a decision. Her first stupid thought was animal. A raccoon. A dog. Her second, sharper, was Harlan back for the rest of his money or the rest of his conscience? Her third was Kellen Roebuck. Her hand went to her pocket blindly for the phone she'd left on the table upstairs. She swore, the words small and loud in the room. Safa? The voice came from above, fainter for the mouth the lid was making smaller. A man's voice. Not Harlan. Not Kellen. Cade? No. Something in it was familiar in the way a voice on a voicemail gets familiar after you stop loving it. She stood very still. Who's there? Another click. The sound of a chain unspooling through a ring. Then, the dull, final kiss of metal on metal. The round lid above sealed. Dark folded down the shaft and tucked itself in around the edges of this room. Her headlamp turned the air into a cone of bright dust. Her breath tried to run, she gripped it by the collar. She turned the headlamp up. The room stayed itself, shelves, cot, chest, radio, and yet it felt changed because she was not the one holding the door anymore. She moved to the hatch and tried the wheel. It turned easily. The square lid closed and opened with a reluctant consent. She climbed the rungs to the next throat, set her shoulder against the round lid, and pushed. Nothing. She braced and pushed harder until heat flashed behind her eyes. The iron did not even creak. Okay, she said aloud, to make the world a place that still answered. Her voice sounded like she'd borrowed it. Okay. She climbed back down and pulled the ladder after, the rope rough and honest in her hands. She told her pulse it could beat as fast as it liked as long as it stayed. She told her legs they could shake while holding. She went to the radio. It wore dust like a skin, but the plug at its back led to a bank of batteries stacked in a wooden rack. She touched one. Not swollen. Not leaking. Useless unless there was still charge. Stupid to hope. She found the switch, turned it. Nothing. Then a whisper, like a remembered station, and the tiniest green wraith of a light. She laughed, a cracked sound. You glorious relic. She turned the dial slowly. The air mewed, squealed, caught a far voice, lost it. She turned back, found the place between noises where signals lived. She pressed the microphone's metal bar. If anyone can hear me, I am. She stopped. What was she? A woman in a hole? A trespasser in her own ground? Trapped underground on Mere Farm, off county line, near Hale Road. I'm not injured. The exit has been closed. If you can hear me, switch once. The radio answered with a small, contemptuous hiss. Then, click. Her skin tightened from collar to wrist. Okay, she breathed, and tried again. If you can hear me, switch twice. Silence. Then, click. Click. Her heart slammed hard enough she needed to put a hand on the table to stay in herself. Who is this? The radio spoke in a voice that wasn't a voice but a recorded thing, old magnetic tape fed through tired teeth. The words were muffled and clear at once, like hearing your name in a dream and realizing you've been awake all along. If you found this, your family, the recording said. If your family, you're in danger. The hair along Safa's arms climbed to stand watch. Her name wasn't on the tape, she told herself that mattered. The next sentence made that lie a small thing. Safa, the recording said softly, like a hand on a child's hair, I'm sorry for what you're about to learn. Her knees went untrustworthy and she sat, not a choice so much as a gravity. The voice was a woman's. Not the too bright county voice. Not the family voices she had on leftover voicemails. The accent was the valley's hybrid, flat vowels, the city's edges. Old tape made the S's breathy, the R's wore little coats of static. You don't know me, the voice said. I was gone before you were old enough to ask the right questions. But I knew your grandfather. He helped build what you're sitting in. He swore an oath with me on that table. And he kept one secret too long. A sound came from beyond the shelves, behind the wall, low and human. Safa's head turned toward it without consulting fear. It wasn't a building's sigh. It wasn't pipes. That was breath. She held her own to listen and heard another's fill, hold, let go. The tape continued, pitiless. If the lid is closed, the woman said, then someone who wants what's down there with you is up here with me. Down here, Safa's voice tried to crack and she sanded it smooth with stubbornness. She stood, headlamp cutting the room into honest pieces, and moved the beam to the far wall. There was the wooden chest she'd opened, the shelves, the cots, the calendar, the radio, but to the left of the radio, where the shadows lounged deepest, the old planks didn't quite meet. A gap. A seam she hadn't read as a door because it was a door trying very hard to be a wall. The breathing came again, slower now, the way you breathe when you've learned how to not be heard. Safa swallowed, set the radio's mic down like a glass that might break, and reached for the seam. The board there lifted with a reluctant groan and then gave. A narrow space beyond opened, 5 feet across, floor-packed earth, air cool enough to make her teeth hurt. The smell was older than the room she'd been in. Older than her house. Older than the names on the county maps. Her headlamp found shapes. A crate with a corner split open, the glint of jars inside like small moons. A metal locker whose paint had bubbled in some long-ago heat. And at the back, snug to the earth, another lid, not round or square but long, hinged, with a glass window smaller than her hand set into the upper third, the way a certain kind of lid carries a certain old promise, look, if you dare, look, and know. A coffin. No. She flinched at the word and it clung anyway. Not a coffin. A storage case. A container. A nothing with a lid and a window and breath fog on its inner glass. Her light found that fog and stopped dead. Fog. On the inside. Her lungs forgot their work and then remembered all at once. She didn't know she'd taken a step until her shin touched the edge. She wiped the glass with her sleeve and the fog cleared in a smear. Behind the window, a dark, shifting blur leaned toward her, then away. The blur resolved into the curve of a cheek, the pale shoal of a closed lid, the place where a pulse speaks at the throat. Eyes opened. They belonged to a child. Or they belonged to a person so thin with time they'd been made small by it. They were not blank. They were not animal bright. They had a human calculation in them that made Safa's bones feel like pipes with cold water rushing through. Those eyes met the light, met her, and did not startle. They waited to see what kind of person she was going to be. From the radio behind her, the voice on the tape kept going because that's what tapes do when you need them to stop. If you choose to open it, the woman said very quietly, you take everything that comes with it. And if you leave it shut, you should know you are not the first mirror to walk away. Above, faint and careful as a fox on leaves, a boot crossed her kitchen floor. Safa set her hands on the long lid's cold rim, her headlamp throwing her shadow across the glass like a continent devouring a sea, and felt inside herself the old compass swing to point at the only north she'd ever trusted. What's in front of you? Who needs you now? She slid the latch. The hinges complained. The breath from inside struck her face, not rot, not grave, but a cool, thin air that seemed to have been saved up for her. Small hands, too small, too steady, rose toward her out of the dark of the box. Don't make a sound, she whispered. A floorboard above her answered with a sigh that wasn't a house's grief but a person's weight shifting. The radio whispered her name one last time like a warning or a blessing. Safa. The child in the box drew a breath that sounded like the first note after a long rest, and someone above began to pick the chain off the lid that would let the night step in on them both. Both. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The sound above was not a house's yawning but a practiced hand teasing metal, link sliding through ring, ring through staple, the final decisive weight of a padlock tongue pressing home. Safa felt the lid's circular weight settle into the throat of the earth as if night itself had shouldered it shut. Her lamp made the silence look granular, dust like slow snow, air like fine ground glass. She kept her palms braced on the long lid's cold rim because it steadied her more than the floor did. "Don't make a sound," she told the child again, and heard her own voice come back to her from the curved walls, calmer than she felt, a tone she'd used once on a horse tangled in wire and another time on her grandfather when he woke from surgery calling for men who had been dead for 30 years. The child's eyes didn't blink. They had that assessing steadiness some animals have when deciding if you're a tree or a fire. Up close, the face sharpened into particulars, a brown too pale for summer, a blue bruise fading yellow along one cheekbone, hair buzzed short at the sides and longer on top, a cut done with clippers by hands that cared about speed, not style. Age was hard to read at first glance. Starvation and fear had a way of folding years like paper. 10, maybe 11. The mouth was split at one corner and clumsily glued with something that shone faint in her light. "Can you talk?" Safa whispered. The chin dipped once, careful. Those eyes slid toward the radio as if the voice still hovering there had an address. "What's your name?" The lips moved without sound. The child tried again, and a whisper came, a floorboard of a voice, "Ren." "What a good name," Safa said, because that was true and because the truth, when you offered it first, made more truth possible. "I'm Safa." "Are you with them?" Ren asked, almost without breath. "No." "Are you?" Ren's mouth pressed thin, a child's version of a held door. She shook her head, once. The tiny motion carved a length of fear into the air between them that Safa could feel with her hands. From the radio on the table, the tape's woman went on without mercy because magnetic memory had no ears to hear danger. "If you're below and the lid's shut, you have to assume you were seen or someone smelled the ground turned. We didn't build this to be found twice." The S-sounds wore their little coats of dust. "There are 2 exits. If the main one's chained, take the pipe. If the pipe's blocked, you wait. But if you wait, it becomes someone else's choosing." Safa's lamp found the seam in the false wall again. The narrow annex might have been a pantry once, now it was a throat leading out of a body. Ren slid her narrow legs over the edge of the long case and stood, her first step patient like a person waking on a boat. The lower half of the box was lined in some kind of silvered fabric, a slim hose ran from its base to a small compressor bolted to the wall. A green light blinked on the compressor like an eyelid trying not to close. "Who put you in there?" Safa asked, hand already moving to the blanket folded at the foot of the cot. She draped it around Ren's shoulders. The child flinched and then held still. "I climbed," Ren said. "They told me to." The word told weighed more than the others, a word learned under orders. "They?" A tiny shrug. A glance up at the lid, the shaft, the long rope of dark between them and summer. Men with the loud truck. Roebuck's white pickup. Orcade's borrowed seal. Or both. Safa bit down on the parts of her mind that liked to multiply fear into futures and made herself inventory the present instead. She set her hand on the metal document tube in the chest long enough to feel its promise, then fastened it into the old canvas messenger bag hanging from a peg by the radio. She added the cigar box marked MIR, the square-headed key, a coil of thin rope from a hook on the ceiling, a pocket knife from the table, 2 sealed water pouches from the carboy rack, a tin of matches, and a roll of gauze. She considered the quin-heavy canvas pouch and left it. Metal made noise when you needed silence. The letters she wrapped back in their oilcloth and slid beneath the wool blanket on the cot as if tucking a sleeping thing. "Shoes?" she asked. Ren wiggled her bare toes against the cold dirt. "Left them to make no sound." She said it like a rule she'd been given. "We'll make our own sounds," Safa said, and put her own extra socks on the child's feet, doubling them. She bound the bruised ankle with gauze when Ren hissed at a certain angle. "Can you climb?" The child nodded, a little too fast. The tape voice kept talking, becoming a metronome for decisions. "The pipeline runs west toward the orchard, Hale's old grid. We buried it deeper where it crosses the fence and we left a lock that isn't a lock." The flat key will feel wrong in your hand. Use it anyway. The woman's breath caught, not with fear but with the cost of remembering. Dud said if anyone ever went this way, it would be because we'd run out of time to debate. If that's true, pick up your bag and move. Safa looked up. She couldn't see the round lid, could only feel its weight in the way the shaft swallowed their sound. We're moving, she told the ear. Then, to Ren, stay behind me. If I stop, you stop. If I crouch, you crouch. If I tell you to run, you run, Ren said, the ghost of a smile trying out her face and deciding to stay. The scene door opened on a narrow tunnel like the inside of a throat, timbers shored, damp in places where cold remembered the old spring. Safa's lamp threw their shadows ahead of them, a tall woman with a bag and a small bird thing in a blanket. The floor was packed and smooth, you didn't get that without feet. The old men who had hauled these timbers and set these nails had believed in their work in a way that made Safa's chest hurt. She ran her palm along a beam and felt the whirls a hand plane had left 50 years ago. How long were you in the box? She asked as they walked, because she needed the child's voice in the tunnel to anchor her own thinking. Ren's answer took a few steps to find. Maybe, night and day. I was thirsty and a woman's voice said that meant it was time, and a man carried me. He told me it's like a game where you hide until the bell rings twice. Safa's mouth went dry as if the radio had been speaking to more than one person. A woman's voice where? The ceiling, Ren said matter-of-factly. It says things sometimes. It said hold still and don't breathe big, and if she's the one with the eyes, you can open the latch. Ren's hand touched her own eyelid lightly, the way people did when they were trying to describe color to someone who'd never seen it. The one with the eyes? Like yours, Ren said, as if it explained everything. The tunnel bent left and dropped a little and then narrowed so the bag scraped the wall. Safa swung it to her chest and went sideways. A breath of cooler air touched her cheek. She could hear, faint, a different silence ahead, the kind of quiet spaces make when they open toward sky. Behind them, in the room, the radio made a small, confused squeal as tape slipped free of spool. Then there was only the small sound of Ren's socks whispering over dirt, the intermittent thump of Safa's bag against her sternum, and the one's heart trying to teach the other a steadier rhythm. How old are you? Safa asked, because age, like names, made a person more anchored. Ren considered as if checking a date scratched in her bones. 12 on the paper, I think. Then, softer, 11 in real. What paper? A pause. The man with the loud truck wrote it, Ren said, as if that settled it. He told the other man I'm 11, he told the phone I'm 12, he told the other phone that I'm nobody. Safa felt something slide into place in her chest, anger or clarity, a blade either way. She thought of the Magnet County seal on the door of the truck, the crease where someone's thumb had lifted it one too many times. Not just drought. Not just water. The Roebucks had been in dirt and rumor for decades, the rumor must have gotten braver. The tunnel ended at a squared shaft with a ladder of rebar set into poured concrete. Above, a small iron trap with a grate in its center admitted a coin of dusk light. Safa killed her headlamp and let her eyes drink the gray. Through the grate, she saw movement, a branch in wind, small leaves showing their silver undersides, a sliver of sky the color of pewter. She turned the lamp back low and found the socket where a lock might have lived once. The flat key in the mirror box had felt like an insult to a lock when she tried its edge. Now, at the base of the great box, a flat slot waited like a mouth. She slid the key in, inelegant, almost frictionless. It went against everything she'd been taught about key and lock. She twisted. Something somewhere inside the concrete made a soft, decisive clunk, as if a weight had been moved off a story. Above them, the grate lifted a finger width on a spring and then hesitated, as if asking for permission. Ren looked at Safa. Safa looked at the world beyond the grate, a cinnabar smudge of Orchard Road, the skeletal arms of old trees reaching like men tugging on sleeves, a halo of gnats making slow scripture in the last light. She pushed. The grate swung up with a breathy sound, leaves kissing its edge. They rose into the evening under a net of branches. The orchard was less an orchard now than a ribcage built of trees, dead wood and stubborn shoots, furred with lichen, the ground gone to a kind of scrub that remembered water as a story. The air had the sweet rot of fallen fruit even though the nearest fruit had fallen years ago. Hale's Grid. The name on the road sign made a new, fierce kind of sense that had nothing to do with directions and everything to do with loyalties. Sappho lowered the grate gently and set a fallen limb across it the way hunters hid their blinds. The world immediately changed, not because the lid had shut but because their eyes had to relearn distance. Far south, the highway smoothed a long sound across the fields. Closer, a cricket tried out a rusty hinge of a song and liked it well enough to keep going. Closer still, the low hum of an idling engine in no hurry. Wren caught Sappho's sleeve. The child's hand was bone and bird in insistence. She pointed, with only her eyes, because her fingers knew better than to speak. Through the sticks of a hedge line, beyond the orchard fence where posts leaned with the exhaustion of irrelevant law, the white pickup had returned. Not in her drive. On the section road that ran the length of the old Hale plots. Sappho's mouth went desert again. She and Wren crouched in the orchard's second row, tree between them and the road, sapling suckers brushing their knees with the light, unhelpful affection of the living. She heard it then, the small beep of an open truck door, a voice that grinned and didn't smile. "Told you she'd be stupid enough to open it," Cade said. Another voice, low and bored as a dog's yawn, or stubborn enough to stay under it. "Doesn't matter. Either way, we sit on the lid and call it righteous." Kellen Roebuck. Sappho would have known that voice in a lineup. She'd learned young how a man could make words into stepping stones and mud, both. "She got a kid with her," a third voice said. Not eager. Not reluctant. Reporting. A shadow behind the other two. Where? Cade again. Something in him wanted points for every answer. "Cameras," the third voice said. "Trail cams. You think those are for deer?" A little laughter in the back of the throat. "She came up on the orchard grid and did just what your lady said she would." A silence that wasn't quiet. "Cade, how old?" "Little enough to sell and not get traced." Not Kellen. Not the third voice. A fourth, on speaker, tinny, expensive. Sappho's stomach dropped with emotion like a bad landing. The county seal was a costume, sure, but the person on the speaker wasn't bothering with costumes now. "Not our business," Kellen said, which was how men like him talked when it was exactly their business and they wanted to be paid extra for saying it wasn't. "You get your pipe. We get what's in the box. We all pretend drought did it." "Radio?" the speaker asked. "Dead," Cade lied. The person on the speaker made a musing sound. "Then fetch what's owed. Minutes cost money, gentlemen." Sappho felt Wren press closer into the smell of her work shirt the way kids do when thunder pretends to be distance and then is suddenly at the house. The child's fingers found the hem and held like a prayer rope. Sappho counted, not to calm herself but to give fear something to eat besides the plan, for men at least, one off-site ear, a truck, a lid shut and chained, the orchard gate open, a road quiet as a throat before a shout. "What pipe?" she breathed into Wren's hair. Wren angled her face up. "The one that steals, I think." She said it without drama, which made it worse. "How do you know?" "Because the woman on the ceiling said don't trust the pipe unless you have the map." Sappho's hand tightened on the strap of the bag. The metal tube inside felt like a spine. She lay on her belly in the leaf litter and slid the tube out enough to crack one end, coaxed a curled scroll to breathe. Ink had bled in the damp places, but the lines still held their own logic, a grid of the orchard, small X's marking valve boxes, a bold line running like a vein from north fence to south, labeled in a hand that was tidy and human, lateral, feed. Another line, fainter, the sort of thing you'd only notice if you had been told a secret and then asked to keep it, bypass, under. Hale's pencil had pressed hard enough to leave a ghost line even where the graphite had vanished. There were notations in Urdu along the margin, Dud's hand, small corrective hums, dates, a scribbled warning, don't open this in the wrong light. And near the center of the grid, a square, cistern, mix. an arrow from there to the word town in a way that made the word look ashamed of how far it had wandered. Safa folded the map to the square and looked up. The orchard's bones held their places as if waiting for a signal they knew they'd never get. The cistern might be a hole in a superstition by now. Or it might be what it was built for, a black lung that breathed stolen water. "Can you be quieter than quiet?" she asked Ren. Ren's face made a small yes. "Then follow." They moved low, the way you move in places that used to belong to someone else. The orchard rows offered cover and the gullies between them offered both path and trap. Twice they froze as headlights made slow blank rectangles on the trunks. Twice they heard Cade laugh as if lighting a cigarette were a story worth telling. Once they heard Kellen say a woman's name like a threat. They did not say it back to the leaves. At the center of the grid, if the grid still meant anything, was the cistern lid, concrete, spider-cracked, ringed with rust bolts whose heads had swelled fat on a feast of years. A small metal hatch sat off to one side like a hinge's idea of a secret. The flat key's wrongness made the hatch's wrongness look like a welcome. Safa slid the key in. Turned. The hatch burped a smell like pennies and algae. They listened. Ren's breath tried to be invisible. Safa could taste the night, dust and creosote and a small sweetness like apple ghosts. No voices close. Engines at distance. Cicadas arguing with God. She lifted the hatch and found the valve and the meter in their tidy steel coffin. The meter's face blinked a single red eye. Words in black on a white label said property of County Water Authority and might as well have winked. A bypass half the diameter of her forearm had been plumbed below, the couplings promising their lies with fresh thread tape still showing. "Shipments," she said before she could stop herself. Ren tugged her sleeve. "Don't say it," the child whispered. "The leaves tell." The map had more than one path. The bypass, underline had a notation, Manway at 17. There were numbers scratched into the concrete near the valve box, someone had used a nail. 15, 16, 17, the last half covered by moss. A square of soil nearby looked like it had been taught to lie but hadn't learned it well. "Here," Safa said, and they knelt and pulled back the thin green hide. Underneath, a metal panel big enough for a man to feel like he was making a bad choice waited with 4 bolts left lazy so a quick hand could be a clever one. She eased them with fingers and prayer and then slid the panel back. Cold breathed up, the kind of manufactured quiet that water made where men forced it to go and not go. Ren made that tiny yes again. "You know this?" Safa asked. "My cousin told me not to look in holes," Ren said. "But he also told me if you had to, look fast and long at once. We don't have cousins now." She said it like a weather report you ignore until the roof goes. "We do," Safa said, surprised at her own certainty like a cup warmed in her hands. "We do now." She slung the bag and eased herself into the manway. It wasn't made for ease. The concrete throat pressed close to collarbone and hip, the latter rungs a little too far apart to make the descent rhythm anything but awkward. The smell was not sewer and not river. It was distilled sunlight flattened into chemistry and bullied forward by pressure. At the bottom, her lamp found a catwalk skirting a round chamber where a black underground moon of water turned without moving. She turned and offered her arms. Ren came down like a saved thing pretending to be a falling one, trusting gravity only because it had a hand under it. They stood on the catwalk and listened. Water talked to itself in small rushes, elsewhere, a valve sighed in sleep. Safa's mind, inclined always to maps, laid the drawn lines over this echoing roundness and made sense. This cistern took in legal water through the meter when the county wished and unmetered water through the bypass when the men with the magnets wished. It mixed them and gave the numbers the story they liked while the orchards drank a different truth. But the old pencil lines, BY Pass, under, said there was more, the remnant of the older system, the pipe that Hale and Dud had buried deeper, back when you planned for drought like you planned for winter, not like you planned for theft. A second door, hatch level with the catwalk, carried a tag under a smear of grime, overflow, divert. A small metal lever wore a padlock. It tried to look official, it looked guilty instead. Safa put the flat key in the lock because wrongness liked company. The lock obliged with a tired click. The lever moved when she asked it like a mule that had decided enough yanking made you a person it could respect. Metal moaned in the walls. Somewhere above, a distant stroke of engine pitch changed. The water's surface in the cistern trembled the way skin does before it shivers. Ren leaned, very slightly, peering through the bars at the turning dark. "If it comes up," she said, "where does it go?" "Out," Safa said. "Or in. Depends who's lying." From the hatch they'd entered, faint as something you meant to remember and didn't, came a sound that wasn't water, rubber on concrete, boot sole, and a curse softened by echo. Someone had found their hole. She cut her headlamp and pulled Ren close enough to feel the small engine of the child's heart. In the dark, the cistern breathed and the someone above rocked the panel undecided. "Cade," Kellen's voice, shaped by cement into a flatter thing. "You first. You're skinny." "And you're a gentleman," Cade replied. There was some scuffle of bodies negotiating hierarchy with knees and elbows. Metal rang softly. The panel scraped and then set aside proper. A beam of light knifed down and turned slow, searching. The catwalk shivered as someone tested the ladder with a toe. Safa's hand found the lever again. Not a weapon. A choice. She told her pulse it could make whatever noise it liked as long as her fingers didn't. The lever had 3 positions: feed, neutral, divert. She had moved it to neutral to hush the cistern while they listened. Now she looked at Ren in the little gray of the hatch light and saw something in the child's eyes that was older than the word child and way older than the man on the ladder deserved. "Hold," she breathed. Ren held. The beam paused knee-height as Cade peered into the dark and persuaded himself there was nothing more to persuade. "Old junk," he said up to the square of bright. "Nothing here but soup in a walkway." "Quit poetry," Kellen answered. "Look harder." Cade sighed and started down. His light swung, it brushed Safa's cheek so close she felt warmth. In the split second between swing and swing, Safa moved. She put the lever to divert and felt the entire room change its mind. Water surged in a circle of deeper black like a thought getting up and leaving. A great low bell note sounded in the pipe. Below the catwalk, a shutter obeyed a command no one had given it in years. The beam ricocheted off moving water, off Ren's eyes, off Safa's teeth in a grimace she didn't intend anyone to see. "What did you do?" Cade yelped, half down the ladder and thinking sickly about how air and water share space poorly. "Shut it," Kellen barked from above, and someone slammed the hatch back against its frame, hungry for blame. "Pull him up." But the ladder had ideas of its own when the water rose. The surge wasn't a tidal wave, it was worse, a steady, muscular insistence. It shouldered Cade off his footholds and made the catwalk low tide. He yelped again and clung to rung and beam, eyes wide whites in the flash of his own light. "Up!" Kellen again, fur ruffled. Hands above reached and found his wrist and swore about how wrists sweat when they want to slip away. Safa didn't wait to see if the hands won. She pulled Ren into the dark mouth of the overflow tunnel, now sighing like a beast learning to breathe. The space was barely taller than her hunched back. The air wore the metallic cold of everywhere the sun hadn't spent itself. She put the lever back to neutral once they were inside, felt the water calm like a dog leaving a porch fight, and kept moving. Behind them, the hatch clanged shut as if the men had decided the sound handled the problem. They crawled. The tunnel rose and fell with the memory of the land above, old ridge, old swale, the long muscle of a watercourse reimagined. Ren crawled like she'd been taught to be small, Safa crawled like a person making a vow to her knees. The world condensed to breath and the scrape of denim and the occasional complaint of an old coupling when a shoulder bumped it. "How did you get on my farm?" Safa asked when her lungs asked for a rest. Ren was quiet long enough that Safa thought the question too much a loaded sack for the girl to lift. "Then, they took me for a helper at the packing shed. They said I was quick and wouldn't talk. I wasn't quick. I talked." The little laugh that followed had nails in it. "A woman said my voice sounded like a hawk in the rafters. Then I didn't talk. Then I was in the truck. Then the woman on the ceiling said, "Hold still." The woman on the ceiling, do you know her name? Ren shook her head and Safa heard the skin of the tunnel whisper back at Hare. She didn't keep it where I could see it. They reached a junction where the tunnel split, one branch rose, the other flattened and ran narrow towards something that might have been wide or dark. The map's ghost line had bifurcations. Hale had not been stingy with options. Safa fished the tube back out and eased the parchment open in the lamp's cupped light. Bypass, under split near the north fence, one path to creek bed, now mostly a throat of stones, one to town edge, the old cannery lot. Creek? Ren asked, peering. Or the place with the big brick where they used to make peaches into cans? Creek puts us in the open, Safa said. Cannery puts us in a dark that used to be work. People will go where they can write the story later. We'll go where they forgot how. Which is which? Safa touched the line toward town. Forgotten, she said. You good? Ren nodded. I like work dark. They took the cannery branch. The air warmed a little, picking up a human smell that had nothing to do with bodies and everything to do with dust learning names. The floor sloped down, then became level. Someone's careful somebody had poured this section. The lamp showed stenciled numbers along the wall at shoulder height, flow rates, valve identifications, a memory of men who liked counting. Do you think your granddad knew about the kid boxes? Ren asked in her wisdom-too-old voice. Safa nearly said they were not kid boxes and then decided the correction would help no one. He knew shelters, she said. He knew water. He knew secrets as a kind of charity. Choose the right person and you keep something alive. Did he choose right? Safa thought of Dudmir's knife on the kitchen table, his laugh in the photograph, the smell of his jacket in the closet when she'd tucked her face there after the funeral like a person hiding in summer coats from winter. I'm here, she said softly. So maybe he at least chose someone stubborn. Stubborn is good, Ren pronounced. The tunnel ended in a metal door bolted into the back of a room. Through a narrow gap by the jamb, Safa smelled oil, old labels, paper. The door had no handle on their side, only a slot the size of a palm. The flat key found it because it had been told where it belonged by people who liked wrongness. The bolt drew back with reluctance and then joy. The door opened into a forgotten corner of the cannery's basement, where file cabinets leaned like tired dancers in a calendar with a 1998 girl in a red cap smiled at no one. They stood in a room full of the kind of ghosts that love paperwork. Safa shut the door softly and turned the bolt. The building's bones let the highway's long moan in and kept the night's insects out. A single bulb on a pole chain surprised them by working when she tried it. The light made the dust motes change from stars to stubborn crumbs. She set the bag on a file cabinet and opened the metal tube for good. The map rolled like a tongue. Beneath the map was something else, a thin ledger bound in blue cloth with the kind of neat line you get from people who still believe pens matter. Hale's hand had made columns for inflow and outflow, dates, names that weren't full names, arrows that meant who had come for water and who had paid in labor. In the back, in Dud's careful Urdu, a list, births in the lane, deaths in the frost, 3 calves from the Roebuck bull that no one had paid for. The ledger read like a Bible written in pipes. Ren touched the corner of the page with one finger and then pulled back like she'd felt heat. If you write it, does it become true? She asked, not idly. If you write it right, Safa said. If you write it wrong, it stays a lie but wears a suit. Voices drifted in through the floor, the soft baritone of 2 men talking like they were standing in the kind of dark where you get brave. The cannery had long ago become one of those half-legal storage places where a person with a key can pretend the rules go different here. Cade was laughing again. It sounded like someone throwing a pocketful of change at a bar and hoping it sounded like bills. She's not going to the creek, Cade said. She didn't strike me as a creek kind. No, Kellen agreed. She struck me as the kind who thinks she can think around you. Those are the ones who make the mistake of opening a door where they closed a promise. Townside? The third voice asked. You put the camera there? Cameras everywhere, Cade said with a pride he didn't deserve. You want to see? Later, the fourth voice said through the phone. I want to see the shipments first. Tomorrow, Kellen said, meaning now. Early. Safa killed the bulb, grabbed the bag, and led Ren through the stacked cabinets to a set of stairs that rose to a door with a rusty exit sign. She tried the latch and met the kind of resistance that made swearing feel like prayer. Ren tilted her head, listening in a way that had nothing to do with ears. Back, she mouthed, and Safa drew them into the shadow of a refrigerator box duct-taped into permanence. The stair door opened inward at the top and light fell down like bad advice. Boots on the top step. A shape she read as Cade's impatience and another as Kellen's shoulders. Cade descended 2 steps, paused. Their feet retreated. The door side shut. Metal complained. A chain whispered through rings. Locked, Ren breathed, reading the sound. Safa exhaled for the first time in a minute that had lasted a lifetime. We need a way out that isn't a way out, she said. An air door. A mistake somebody forgot to erase. They found it behind a row of broken sealers, an old delivery chute with a bend that would make you curse and a gap at the top the size of a generous man's shoulders. The grate was rusted through. Safa put her weight into it and felt a protest and then an apology. They climbed a ladder slick with time and rose into a space behind the cannery's loading dock where pallets had gone to compost and no one with a badge had walked in a decade. The night smelled different here, more river, less field. The old rail spur ran a dark line of iron through weeds. Beyond it, the grain elevator's gray ribs wrote the moon a letter it didn't answer. A dog barked twice and then remembered it was nobody's problem. We go where? Ren asked. Home, Safa said, and the word surprised her with how hard it hit. But not by the road. She put the map in her head again. The cannery. The orchard. The farm. The angle between them if you drew a straight line through fences and pride. She set a course through back lots and drainage ditches where frogs spoke in code. Ren followed without argument, which was either wisdom or exhaustion. They stayed off gravel because gravel told on you. They stayed in ditch where the ditch would allow and in shadow where it had the courtesy of existing. Twice headlights washed over them and made Ren's hand a vice on Safa's wrist. Once they had to belly under a barbed wire fence while a cow on the other side chewed and watched and offered neither help nor hindrance. When the square of Safa's farmhouse finally rose against the sky like a paper cutout, a feeling ran through her that was not relief and not dread. It was like arriving at a word you had been using wrong. A shape moved on the porch. A familiar shape. For a moment the body made out of silhouette looked like Dud'd come up to call her in. Then it set a coffee mug on the rail and she knew it was a man whose voice had taught her phone to flinch when he called. Cameron. He had on the jacket he always wore when he wanted to make something sound reasonable. He leaned against her porch post the way younger men lean when they plan to say sorry and older men lean when they want to call sorry by another name. Ren stiffened and slid herself behind Safa, small hands pressing into the denim at Safa's hips as if she could merge with the cloth. Friend, she breathed. Was, Safa said, and her mouth tasted like old coffee and new metal. The door opened from the inside. The light behind Cameron was the warm square of her kitchen, the room that had never learned how to be mean to her even when she was mean to herself. Cade stepped into that light like he'd been born in it. Kellen followed, hat in hand as if he were paying respects instead of debts. Between them, moving like a shadow that had not forgotten it used to be a woman, came the voice from the tape, wearing a body. She was older than the voice had been and younger than the year on the calendar would have made her. Gray had braided itself into dark hair that had chosen to stay. Her face had the new lines people get when they've spent years arguing with themselves and winning just enough to keep arguing. When she saw the yard, she stopped. Her eyes found the orchard. Then the well. Then the place where the lid was hidden under plywood and blocks. She did not look at Safa yet. She looked at the dirt. Ruth? Kellen said, his eyebrows making a question his mouth didn't have the courage to ask. The woman lifted her chin. You don't get to say my name, Roebuck. She didn't raise her voice. The air raised its attention for her. Cameron shifted his weight. He smoked when he was anxious, and he wasn't smoking now, which meant he'd decided anxiousness was a luxury he couldn't afford in front of her. "Safa," he called, trying for normal. "Please come up. We should talk like people." Kellen laughed, short and empty. "People," he said. "That's generous." Ruth Hale, because that had to be her, it wore her like a well-fitted coat, stepped onto the porch edge and looked straight out into the dark where Safa and Ren crouched behind the low wall of her grandfather's old flower bed. "Safamir," she said, as if saying the name completed a circuit. "I'm sorry the first time you heard me I was only a voice." Safa had the fast, disorienting sensation she sometimes got when stepping off a stage and into street light, how the world changed size without changing shape. She rose enough to be seen because she wanted to choose the moment. Ren stayed pressed to her thigh like a second pocket. Kellen's satisfaction came and went on his face as quick as a match. "Knew you weren't Creek," he said. "Come on up. We can all be civilized." "I don't do civilized," Safa said. "I do honest." She stepped to the edge of the porch light, just shy of it, where people had to squint to see you and ended up seeing themselves a little more than you. "You closed my lid. You came into my kitchen. You took my house and said please." She looked at Cameron and gave him the exact amount of permission their history warranted, which was to say none. "Don't we me?" Cameron's mouth made the beginning of a plea and then thought better of it. "You're scaring me," he said instead, unhelpful. "And you don't scare me." "Good," Safa said. Ruth took one deliberate step down onto the yard and the porch light gave her its ransom. Up close, in the cheap yellow glow, her eyes had that Hale family flint you saw in old photos where people were trying not to blink. "I recorded the tape because I knew one of two things would be true," she said. "Either I'd be dead when you needed me or I'd be trapped with them when you needed me. I'm glad and sorry that it's the second." "Needed you for what?" Safa asked. "To tell you the truth before they sell you a better one," Ruth said. "They want the pipe. They want the proof the pipe exists. They want to say they made it to save the county. They want to sell water to the county that belonged to us before we learned to spell county." Kellen made a sigh that had teeth in it. "Ruth likes poetry when she's drunk on righteousness," he said lightly. "The pipe is theft. It's also the reason your almonds used to grow. Pick your sermon." Ruth didn't look at him, she looked at Ren. And Ren did what some children only do in front of the rarest adults, she stepped out from behind Safa of her own will. Ruth's face crumpled and rearranged itself like a map being updated. "Oh," she said, one syllable with the weight of a fall harvest. "They've started taking kids again." "Again?" Safa's voice cut itself on the word. Ruth's eyes said this is not for now and this is exactly for now in the same breath. She made herself continue. "They take them to make people like you hurry," she said. "To make people like me remember what fear tastes like." "Don't turn this into church," Kellen said. He put his boot on Safa's bottom step as if claiming mortgage by metatarsal. "We're buying your silence, Mir. With cash, with water, with the promise we don't come back. You can waste that by giving us speeches, or you can spend it on whatever someone like you spends things on." "What's someone like me?" Safa asked, genuinely curious what category he'd conjure. "You don't know yet," Kellen said. "But I do. Someone who can't afford to be brave because brave doesn't pay the light bill." Ruth's laugh was short and surgical. "You hear how they talk when they think they're being kind?" she asked Safa. "Like you're a table they can set their pity on." "Where's the lid key?" Kate asked, because he was the kind who got restless when talk became air. "You close that thing wrong and people will go missing in 5 minutes. You think they aren't going to send the sheriff? He's already drunk enough to sign whatever paper the county hands him. The sheriff will arrest you for trespass if he sobers up long enough to wonder why his field cam showed you in my yard at noon," Safa said. "You going to show him your magnet seal?" Kate's grin showed a chip he hadn't paid to fix in 9th grade. "You'd be surprised what seals people will squint at if you talk fast." The night did something then that wasn't weather. It put a cool hand on Safa's neck and pushed her forward 1/2 step on the path she was already walking. She reached into the bag and brought out the metal tube and the map and held them where Ruth could see but the men could only imagine. "Here's the truth, then," she said. "The pipe exists because your grandfather and mine refused to be small under a big sun. They made it because you can save an orchard and still sleep if you write every gallon down in a book you leave where your enemies can find it. They left a key that feels wrong on purpose. They left a room under my yard where a girl could hide and live as long as someone kept their word. And they left me a sentence on an index card: if you take this, you promise to finish it." Ruth's gaze dropped to the map as if it were a newborn, then it climbed back to Safa's face. "Finish it means, decide what it's for now," she said quietly. "Drought made thieves out of people who used to be neighbors. The county will hire those thieves and make them honest with checks. If we let them, they'll own the river and invoice the rain. If we don't, they'll try to make examples of anyone who remembers their own wells." Cameron rubbed his forehead like a man trying to knead a headache from an idea. "Safa," he said, in the voice he used when he pretended love was logistics, "these people are not a story. They're a problem with guns." "I know," Safa said. "I've been reading the footnotes." Wren tugged her shirt hem twice. "A small signal." Safa looked down. The child's eyes had narrowed just slightly, that precise expression she'd worn in the tunnel when listening with something other than ears. "2 more men," Wren breathed. "At the fence." Ruth's jaw flexed. "He brought the cousins," she said without looking around. "They're worse than he is. They do things for free if the things make them feel like old stories told about their granddads." Kellen smiled, slow, pleased to be read correctly. "I brought the future," he said. "And the future is merciless where the past was sentimental." Safa's mind did another of those map tricks. Orchard, cannery, cistern, farm, sheriff, cousins, trail cams. The river of it all would carry her whether she waited or not. She could feel the decision leaning in her ribs like a person about to whisper, "Run. Fight. Bargain. Call. Hide." None felt true by themselves. All felt true together. Ruth took a small, defiant step that made Kellen's hand go to his belt without his permission. "You're going to let that child go now," she said. "You're going to take your truck and your cousins and your speaker and your lies and you're going to—" The night cut her off with a new sound from the west, a long, tired siren trying to decide if it was a kindness or a threat. Sheriff. Or volunteer ambulance. Or both. Cade swore softly. Kellen's jaw did something old and mean. "Change of plan," he said, and his voice dropped an octave into the register men use when they've decided who they are. He reached into his jacket and came out with a pistol that looked ordinary and therefore more dangerous. "We will perform a civic duty. We will secure this property for the county until the paperwork arrives. We will keep everyone safe in the most literal meaning of the word." He aimed the word safe at Safa's chest. "Hand me the tube, Ms. Mir." Safa did not lift her hands. She did not drop her eyes. She let the map and the tube hang loose in one hand as if they were groceries. She had been raised by a man who taught her the right way to lift a bag of feed from ground to truck without breaking her back. "The lesson applies to more than feed," he'd said. She discovered now that it applied to more than weight. It applied to wanting. She wanted to swing the tube like a club. She wanted to run for the back door and the lid and the ladder and the radio and hide there until the world above forgot her name. She wanted to throw the map at Ruth and say, "You do it, you built it." She wanted to give Kellen what he asked and call it strategy. She recognized each wanting as a good liar and did not hire any of them. "Wren," she said very softly, "do you trust me to do a stupid thing smart?" Wren's small hand found 3 of Safa's fingers and held. "Yes." Safa stepped forward into the light like a person stepping into her own photograph. The tube stayed in her hand. The map, she lifted like an offering and not an apology. She extended it toward Kellen, 1 step closer, 2. The men shifted. Ruth held still. Cameron blinked. The siren rode its indecisive line across the dark. Kellen reached for the map because men like Kellen always reach for the visible thing. Sappho let him take it, let him feel the weight of paper, the seduction of lines, the illusion of owning a river by drawing it. He smiled like a boy with a frog he planned to show off at school. Then she opened the tube with her other hand, fast as pulling a bandage, and dumped what was inside into her palm, not second maps, not bonds, not coins. A single small device fell into the light like an idea a generation late, a transmitter the size of a deck of cards, its red light winking the way the meters had winked at the cistern. It had a switch and a label in her, Hale's tidy hand, Town, on. "What's that?" Kate asked, because he hated not knowing whether to grin. Sappho flicked the switch. Somewhere beneath the orchard, the bypass that had learned to behave began to misbehave. Somewhere under the cannery, the old valves remembered their original allegiances. Somewhere in the sheriff's office, a panel that had been quiet since 1999 woke and decided to sound like an error the county couldn't ignore. The siren that had been wandering found its key and decided to become a chorus. Kellen looked down at the map and realized it had shifted in his hands from a seduction to an indictment. "What did you?" he began, and for the first time that night, Sappho got to watch his face learn surprise. Lights came on along the county road like neighbors checking a noise. The cousins at the fence turned their heads in unison like deer learning math. The trail cams, which had been obedient, suddenly had too many things to tell and chose all of them. The chain on the round lid in Sappho's yard, because Ruth had built redundancy into secrets and Dud had signed his name to Prudence, went slack. Wren's fingers tightened painfully around Sappho's. "Ron," the girl whispered, not like a coward but like a runner in the starting blocks asking the gun when. "Yes," Sappho said. "Run." They ran. Ruth ran with them. Cameron startled and ran at their shoulder because sometimes cowardice can be tricked into courage if you don't give it time to sit down. Cade shouted something about property rights in a voice that a dog didn't even bark at. Kellen raised the pistol and then didn't fire, not because he was merciful but because the siren drew a cruiser like a magnet draws a nail and he was learning how quickly a story can change when a uniform walks on stage. They reached the plywood. Sappho threw it aside with a strength she had not asked for and did not question. The chain lay coiled like a shed skin. The round lid's ring showed its scar of lever mark. Ruth bent, her body remembering the right shape, and hauled. The mouth opened. Cold breathed up. The ladder waited like a choice. "Go," Ruth said to Wren, no hesitation. "Feet, hands, count." Wren went. Sappho went right after because she knew better than to tell a child to be brave from a distance. Ruth followed, then Cameron with a noise that admitted nothing. Above them, boots pounded in dirt and a deputy said "hold up" in a voice that wanted to be obeyed. The night cut her off with a new sound from the west, a long, tired siren trying to decide if it was a kindness or a threat. Sheriff. Or volunteer ambulance. Or both. Cade swore softly. Kellen's jaw did something old and mean. "Change of plan," he said, and his voice dropped an octave into the register men use when they've decided who they are. He reached into his jacket and came out with a pistol that looked ordinary and therefore more dangerous. "We will perform a civic duty. We will secure this property for the county until the paperwork arrives. We will keep everyone safe in the most literal meaning of the word." He aimed the word safe at Sappho's chest. "Hand me the tube, Ms. Meir." Sappho did not lift her hands. She did not drop her eyes. She let the map and the tube hang loose in one hand as if they were groceries. She had been raised by a man who taught her the right way to lift a bag of feed from ground to truck without breaking her back. "The lesson applies to more than feed," he'd said. She discovered now that it applied to more than weight. It applied to wanting. She wanted to swing the tube like a club. She wanted to run for the back door and the lid and the ladder and the radio and hide there until the world above forgot her name. She wanted to throw the map at Ruth and say, "You do it, you built it." She wanted to give Kellen what he asked and call it strategy. She recognized each wanting as a good liar and did not hire any of them. "Wren," she said very softly, "do you trust me to do a stupid thing smart?" Wren's small hand found 3 of Sappho's fingers and held. "Yes." Sappho stepped forward into the light like a person stepping into her own photograph. The tube stayed in her hand. The map, she lifted like an offering and not an apology. She extended it toward Kellen, one step closer, two. The men shifted. Ruth held still. Cameron blinked. The siren rode its indecisive line across the dark. Kellen reached for the map because men like Kellen always reach for the visible thing. Safa let him take it, let him feel the weight of paper, the seduction of lines, the illusion of owning a river by drawing it. He smiled like a boy with a frog he planned to show off at school. Then she opened the tube with her other hand, fast as pulling a bandage, and dumped what was inside into her palm, not second maps, not bonds, not coins. A single small device fell into the light like an idea a generation late, a transmitter the size of a deck of cards, its red light winking the way the meters had winked at the cistern. It had a switch and a label in her, Hale's tidy hand, town, on. "What's that?" Kate asked, because he hated not knowing whether to grin. Safa flicked the switch. Somewhere beneath the orchard, the bypass that had learned to behave began to misbehave. Somewhere under the cannery, the old valves remembered their original allegiances. Somewhere in the sheriff's office, a panel that had been quiet since 1999 woke and decided to sound like an error the county couldn't ignore. The siren that had been wandering found its key and decided to become a chorus. Kellen looked down at the map and realized it had shifted in his hands from a seduction to an indictment. "What did you?" he began, and for the first time that night, Safa got to watch his face learn surprise. Lights came on along the county road like neighbors checking a noise. The cousins at the fence turned their heads in unison like deer learning math. The trail cams, which had been obedient, suddenly had too many things to tell and chose all of them. The chain on the round lid in Safa's yard, because Ruth had built redundancy into secrets and Dud had signed his name to prudence, went slack. Wren's fingers tightened painfully around Safa's. "Ron," the girl whispered, not like a coward but like a runner in the starting blocks asking the gun when. "Yes," Safa said. "Run." They ran. Ruth ran with them. Cameron startled and ran at their shoulder because sometimes cowardice can be tricked into courage if you don't give it time to sit down. Cade shouted something about property rights in a voice that a dog didn't even bark at. Kellen raised the pistol and then didn't fire, not because he was merciful but because the siren drew a cruiser like a magnet draws a nail and he was learning how quickly a story can change when a uniform walks on stage. They reached the plywood. Safa threw it aside with a strength she had not asked for and did not question. The chain lay coiled like a shed skin. The round lid's ring showed its scar of lever mark. Ruth bent, her body remembering the right shape, and hauled. The mouth opened. Cold breathed up. The ladder waited like a choice. "Go," Ruth said to Wren, no hesitation. "Feet, hands, count." Wren went. Safa went right after because she knew better than to tell a child to be brave from a distance. Ruth followed, then Cameron with a noise that admitted nothing. Above them, boots pounded in dirt and a deputy said hold up in a voice that wanted to be obeyed. They slid the lid as far closed as courage allowed. The shaft swallowed the light and fed back the green ghost from the radio. Below, the square hatch gleamed in Safa's lamp like an eye. The room waited exactly as they had left it and not at all. The radio, offended at being made the center of attention again, crackled a word and then another and then a valley's worth of noise. The compressor winked its green eyelid. The long lid on the box stood open, its breath spent, its purpose altered. Ruth stood in the middle of the room and put one hand flat on the table where once a promise had been inked. "Dudmere," she said, not to summon a ghost but to thank a partner. "We need your stubborn now." Safa turned the transmitter's switch again and watched the red wink die. The sirens did not stop. Momentum is a kind of confession. Wren climbed into the far annex as if the dark had been waiting for her specifically. Cameron hovered by the ladder like a man who had misread every moment and was now trying to find a page with pictures. The radio spat and found words built out of gravel and breath. Unit 3 en route, cannery water main, pressure reading, anyone got eyes on Roebuck truck? Kellen's voice came, muffled by dirt, coming down the shaft like a rumor heavy with its own weight. Not a shout. Not a threat. A vow, this isn't over. No, Safa agreed, mostly to herself, the words too low to climb the ladder. It's the middle. She looked to Ruth, then to Wren, then to the map that was not a map anymore but a set of choices. The room felt smaller than it had an hour ago and bigger than the county. Up the ladder, the law and the men who rented it. Down the tunnel, the cannery and a town deciding what kind of truth it wanted to be caught with. Between, a farm and a woman and a child and an old partnership that needed a new sentence. Tell me the part you didn't put on the tape, Safa said to Ruth, because she could feel that there was one. Ruth's face did the honest thing, flinched. If you open the pipe to the town, she said, it drains the orchard's vein for good. It saves houses and kills trees. It makes enemies out of the living and the dead. And if you close it, the county will condemn your well, your road, your air. She looked at Wren. And they will keep taking children who make them late for their meetings. Wren's gaze didn't waver. We choose, she asked, not like a child, not like an adult, like a person asked to fill a place in the world and deciding whether they fit. Safa set both palms on the table. The wood held the pressure of decades in her 10 fingers and said, decide. The transmitter sat by her wrist like a held breath. The map spread itself with all its lines like veins or branches or roads. Boots above. Voices deciding what story to write on reports. A new engine arrived and shut off. Men's patience and impatience traded places and tried on each other's hats. Ruth, Safa said, if we open the town, the orchard dies. Yes. And if we close the town, the kids disappear. Ruth's eyes, older than they had been a minute ago, met Safa's without blinking. Yes. Then we don't open or close, Safa said, surprising herself with her own voice. We change the map. How? Cameron asked, like a man chewing gravel because there's no bread. Safa put her finger on the bypass, underlined and traced it to the cannery and then drew, in air, another line, not on paper yet, to the old river bed, dry on top, never dry in bone, and then back. We bleed the pipe into the river instead of the meter, she said. We turn theft into flood. We make the county drink their own story. Ruth stared at the invisible line as if it had been there the whole time, waiting for someone with the right eyes to notice. There's a gate, she said slowly. A rust gate we never used because it was for mood and miracles. But if you reverse the valve at the bridge, they'd think the main burst, Safa finished, and felt a dangerous grin split her face. They'd be too busy mopping the wrong floor to find the pipe. And every yard downriver would get a night of grain. Wren smiled the way children smile when you make a rule that sounds like a dare. The radio squawked like it was choking on a laugh it didn't know how to have. Water in the street at Hale, repeat, water in the voice cut and was replaced by another. Unit 6, you got eyes on. Above them, someone pounded the lid with an open palm and called Safa's name like a person knocking on a confessional. Safa let the knocking pass through her like a train. Where's the bridge valve? She asked. Ruth pointed, not at the map but at the room, as if the room and the river were layered like vellum in her memory. You'll need the flat key, she said. And you'll need to not be afraid of things that were mean before you were born. I am afraid, Safa said, and felt how true it was ripple through the new plan like current through wire. I just won't listen to it. She picked up the transmitter. She picked up the tube. She picked up the child's hand. Ruth picked up the map and the ledger and the square-headed key that had never wanted to belong to any lock. Cameron picked up his breath and tried to hang it like a coat on a hook that wasn't there. The tunnel waited like a mouth. The town waited like a jury. The river waited like a thing that had never stopped being itself even when men forgot to write it down. They stepped into the dark together. Above, the men and their sirens and their small, official lights argued about what to call what was happening. Below, the old wood whispered with its own kind of courage. The first drop of redirected water found the dry creek bed like a homing bird, and Safa felt, faint through the wall, the way the land sighed when someone finally remembered the right word. Go, Ruth said, and her voice had the strength of someone who had already paid the first price. Now. Before the county understands math. Safa squeezed Ren's hand once like a promise and led them toward the gate they would have to learn to open in the dark. Behind them, under their farm, the radio crackled in a stranger's voice, "Be advised, reports of unauthorized release along the dry," and then the transmission cut off sharply as if a hand had silenced it on purpose. Safa did not look back. She did the only arithmetic that mattered: 3 hearts, 1 map, and a night that would not wait. She took a breath deep enough to touch every old fear from here to her grandfather's last laugh and stepped forward, and the ground ahead of her answered with a sound so sudden and wrong that her skin did not find a word for it before her mind did. Metal on metal. A gate unlatching without a hand. Something in the dark had opened first. It wasn't a person. The sound carried the deep, throat-clearing authority of hydraulics, metal shrugging into motion after years of telling itself it had already done enough. In front of Safa, the tunnel shouldered wider and showed a rusted grate set in a frame. The latch had sprung on its own. A damp breath pushed through, the smell of iron and old leaves and the ghost of a creek that never admitted it had died. Ruth's hand brushed Safa's shoulder, a steadying weight. "The gate I told you about," she murmured. "It opens when the underflow rises, if the pivot hasn't seized." "We woke it." Ren squeezed Safa's fingers, then let go so she could peer into the opening the way small animals look at holes they partly trust. The child's face wore the focused calm of someone listening to more than air. Safa tested the grate. It swung grudgingly, then yielded, the hinge crying once, a fox bark of metal, and then falling silent the way a room does when it learns not to give you away. Water slid beyond the opening in a sheet no thicker than a page and just as decisive. Behind them, up the shaft and above the sealed round lid, men argued about what to call the night. Below, the tunnel offered a way that wasn't a way until someone chose it. "Go," Safa said gently to Ren. "Feet first. Hands where you can feel the wall." Ren nodded and slipped through. She moved like she had been taught by hunger in small spaces, quietly, with respect, ready to stop if the tunnel asked. Safa followed, the bag of familiar weight at her ribs. Ruth came last, one palm on the grate until she stepped past it and let it swing back with a hush of wire on wire. Cameron hesitated a heartbeat too long and then shouldered in behind Ruth like a man learning a new verb and not liking it but choosing it anyway. The space beyond ran narrow for 6 paces and then opened into a culvert tall enough to crouch and then stand. Moon-gray light seeped through a grate high overhead, striping them with prison bars of meadow. The water here was nothing dramatic, a black silk moving slow and certain in a channel lined with stone. Once, men had laid these stones neat as scripture. Now some sat cocked and some leaned and some were simply gone, but the line held, a river's memory extends farther back than men's. "Bridge valve is 2 bends down," Ruth said softly. "You'll know it by the bullhead bolts and by how it resists. It likes to be left alone." "Like you," Cameron said before he could stop himself. The look Ruth gave him shut that door and locked it. They worked their way along the ledge, boots slick on silt. Safa kept one hand on the wall because she trusted the wall to tell her the truth about what it could hold. Ren kept pace against her hip, light, precise, so present that if Safa closed her eyes, she could have described exactly where the child's knees were by the way the air moved. The first bend turned them under Main Street. The culvert hummed with the sound of tires above and the far rattle of a diesel that never learned subtlety. Voices came faint and bright at once, bouncing down: sheriff, deputy, Roebuck cousin, some neighbor with a phone and a sense that the night might finally be ready to listen to his opinions. Safa didn't look up. She kept moving. The second bend brought them to the valve. It crouched in the wall like a heavy-shouldered animal gone to sleep on guard. A wheel sat bolted to a stem. The stem vanished into the wall just below an iron plate stamped when stamps still mattered: County Flood Control, Emerg Use Only. Someone had painted over those words a generation ago with the color of forgetting. "Flat key?" Ruth asked. Safa already had it in her hand. The key slid into a recessed slot that didn't look like a slot until you needed one. She turned. The lock gave as if surprised to be asked with courtesy. She set both palms on the wheel and pulled. The metal shuddered and then refused. Left, Ruth said softly. She's stingy to the right. Safa set her shoulder and leaned. The wheel creaked 2 teeth and stopped like a stubborn old mare. She gritted and pulled again. Again. Her shoulder barked. Her hands slipped and she reset her grip. The wheel agreed to 3 more teeth, then 4, enough to make the water's song deepen half a note. Let me, Cameron said, voice low and human. He set his hands on the wheel above hers and leaned in with his back and thighs, breath controlled the way you breathe when you carry someone else's weight. The stem turned. The wall groaned as if unlearning a habit. Water found a new promise and took it. The culvert shivered. Far off, a sound changed pitch, the hiss of the cistern, the cough of a pump losing argument, 100 small household sighs that meant faucets waking. Enough, Ruth said, when the wheel reached the hash mark someone had chiseled into the wall a lifetime ago and painted in with nail polish. Any more in the town will think a pipe burst. That's the idea, Safa said, and heard the thread of her own anger and her own joy twine the way 2 strings make a fuller note together. Wren leaned over the water and watched it shoulder into its new course, faint whirls and riffles, the delicate chaos of motion redeciding itself. The creek remembers, she said matter-of-factly. It always does. Behind them, somewhere under the cannery, a door slammed and boots hit metal. They had not won time, they had borrowed it. Borrowed time collects interest in loud steps. Safa nodded to the new sound, then to Ruth. Back to the ladder? Ruth shook her head. There's a second way. If the county's on your porch and the cousins are in the cannery, you don't go home the same way you left it. She pointed down a side throat that looked like nothing except the idea of a path. Hale's line to the orchard. It runs under the lane and comes up by the poplars behind your back field. Safa pictured the poplars and felt a muscle in her chest unclench. Move, she said, and they moved. The side tunnel ran low, then lower. Safa ducked, then hunched, then crawled. Silt dampened her knees. Something skittered ahead and hit its name. The air carried a sweetness now, the old orchard again, apples and beeswax and a perfume that had outlived its orchards. Wren crawled without complaint. Ruth crawled like a woman who had delivered 3 children in this town and told the nurse to hush when the nurse tried to make a fuss. Cameron crawled like a man remembering a boyhood he had skipped. They came up under the poplars. The panels here were boards weathered to the color of apology, reinforced with iron straps and someone's sense of humor. Safa shouldered the hatch. It gave it the second persuasion. They rose into wind, honest wind, not duck dreams, and starlight. The orchard lay to their left like a ribcage, the farmhouse ahead in silhouette, the county road a dark belt beyond. The planks closed behind them with an exactness that would have made Dudmere nod once and say good. What they stepped into was not quiet. In the yard, lights saturated the grass and bleached geometry. 2 cruisers, the white pickup, a county truck with the real seal this time, and a wrecker idled like nervous cattle. Neighbors clustered in the ditch across the road, their murmurs a hive. The sheriff stood near the porch, trying to look like leadership. Kate hovered with a notebook he didn't own the right to, pretending to tally what didn't belong to him. Kellen, hat off now, jaw set, talked into a phone that talked to money. Between the cruisers, a woman in a deputy's khaki, youngish, hair in a neat plait, eyes that looked like she'd learned to read rooms before they decided what they were, listened and did not nod. Ruth breathed out a very soft sound that was not a word. Relief, maybe. Or hope trying on boots again. Deputy Luan, Ruth said, barely a whisper. Her daddy ran the bait shop at Coyote Bridge. Her mother delivered half this valley. She knows what a story looks like from the inside. Wren pressed close to Safa's leg enough to anchor both of them. Now, she breathed. Now, Safa said, and stood. She stepped into the wash of light like she was stepping out of her own shadow, and for the first time that night she didn't aim to be half seen. She let the deputies and the neighbors and the sheriff and the cousins have a full look at the woman they thought they were telling a story about. Ruth stepped up on her left, not behind. Wren stayed tight to her right like a wing tucked in for weather. Cameron hovered 3 feet away, exactly where you stand when you want to help and don't know if you're allowed. Cade saw her first. His face did that simple geometry men's faces do when their math is wrong: surprise subtracted from arrogance leaves fear. Kellen turned and his eyes went bright the way coyote eyes do when you catch them in the radius of your headlights: flash of startle, then calculation. Deputy Luan focused. The set of her mouth changed. "Ms. Mir," she called, voice amplified by the car hoods and the way people shut up when they smell truth about to stand up. Safa stopped with the fence between her and all of them because good fences are not only for cows. "Deputy," she said, calm. "You're on my property. If you're here to help, you can come closer. If you're here to agree with whoever brought you, stay with them." The sheriff bristled, because bristle is what you do when you don't have policy. "We're here because water is flowing where it shouldn't," he announced to whoever needed his voice to make a sentence. "We've got reports of a deliberate release." "Water is flowing where it used to," Ruth said, not bothering to lift her voice. "We chose to remember." Kellen lifted the map as if raising a flag half-mast. "They have the plans for an illegal diversion," he said smoothly. "They opened decommissioned gates without authorization. We're securing evidence pending a warrant." "Those words," Deputy Luan said mildly, "mean less when you say them, Mr. Roebuck, on account of your uncle pulling from 3 wells that don't exist on any paper but your cousin's glove box." Neighbors murmured differently. Kellen's jaw made a new shape. Deputy Luan looked back at Safa. "I'll be plain. Did you open something?" Safa weighed a dozen different ways to answer against the simple way. She chose simple. Grandfathers approve of simple. "Yes," she said. "I opened a gate to the creek so the creek could remember it existed. I did it because the other choice was giving the county the power to bill my orchard for water my orchard already paid for with 100 years of fruit and labor. And I did it because a child was put in a box and told to be quiet until the right woman opened the latch." Wind moved through the poplars in a sound like a long dress being turned around on a hanger. The neighbors went still. The sheriff blinked as if dust had got into his eyes and delivered a sentence. Cade found his mouth but not his words. "Who put a child in a box?" Deputy Luan asked, voice even, as if she were counting out coins for everyone to see. No one answered, which was also an answer. Safa felt Ren lean closer and made her own voice the shape of a hand offered. "This child," she said. "She moved the way you move when you want to show the thing you're protecting without handing it to anyone." Ren stepped forward 1/2 step and peered from behind Safa's thigh, not brave and not brave, exactly what she could afford. "There are others," Ruth said into the hush. "There will always be others as long as we let men run pipe underground and ledger above ground with different ink." She held up the ledger and the map. "We brought receipts." Kellen made a sound that wanted to be a laugh and lost its courage halfway out of his throat. "You expect a court to take a prayer book of doodles and call it law? I expect a jury to hear a recording of your man instructing another to claim county authority while wearing a magnet on his truck," Deputy Luan said, and the mildness left her voice with a small, satisfying click. She jerked her chin at a deputy by the cruiser. "Levi? Run the cam footage." "The one she sent." Levi, the kind of deputy who looks like a church volunteer until you notice his unerring hands, tapped the monitor built into the passenger dash. The cruiser's camera mapped the orchard in black and white truth, Cade's white pickup with the seal slightly crooked, Kellen's boots on Safa's steps, the cousins slouching in a way that pretended to be boredom and was only waiting. A mic, placed with old hunters cunning under the porch, Ruth's doing when she came before them, or duds a decade ago, had heard enough to make a story with fewer gaps. "You get your pipe, we get what's in the box," Cade's voice bragged to the phone. "We all pretend drought did it." Kellen's answer played like a song he didn't want to be caught knowing the words to. "You buy the sheriff a steak and he signs whatever paper he's handed." The sheriff went red in a way that had less to do with shame than with losing grip on narrative. "Now hold on," he began, but Deputy Luan held up a hand and the knight preferred her fingers to his sentence. Levi let the clip run. Another voice, the fourth, tinny and bored, breathed orders through the speaker. It named an office. It named a time. It named a price. It said you boys are slow and I'm out of patience. Ruth watched the deputies scream with no expression, like a midwife watching a monitor, counting invisible heartbeats, preparing to raise the alarm at the right second and not one before. "Where's your warrant, Mr. Roebuck?" Deputy Lujan asked, after the clip ran to quiet and the sirens in the distance came back into their original shape, honest noise without narrative. "For entering her house. For closing her lid. For handling anything." Kellen found his hat and put it back on his head like a man remembering his manners and hoping they could substitute for honesty. "We acted under emergency provision," he said, "to protect county assets." "What assets?" Lujan asked. "The ones you plumbed without a permit or the kid you loaded a box for?" Cade spoke then for the first time without calculation. "We didn't touch any kids," he said, and the thin, defensive line of the denial cut the crowd in two, those who wanted to believe him because it was easier and those whose faces said, "You've been lying to us so long you sound like weather now." Wren surprised them all. She stepped fully into the light and let it say the bruise on her cheekbone out loud. She didn't point or accuse. She just existed in front of them without permission, and existing broke something open the way a freeze cracks a pipe. "The man with the loud truck told the other man I was 11 and told the phone I was 12 and told the other phone I was nobody," she said. "He said if I didn't move he would carry me. He carried me." Her voice was steady in the softest way, like a small river doing the same honest thing all day long. A neighbor woman in a floral housecoat put her hand to her mouth. A man behind her, a Roebuck cousin only barely, for once didn't know where to put his eyes. The sheriff didn't bristle this time because there was nothing left around that would read it as authority. Deputy Lujan's jaw worked once and then went still. "Ms. Meir," she said, "will you and Ms. Hale and this child come stand by my car while I write down the names these men just gave me by accident?" Safa weighed the risk of moving in light against the risk of letting the scene be defined without her body in it. She gave Wren a look, the question kind. Wren nodded, her chin a small directive. They walked together toward the cruiser. Ruth's stride matched Safa's so exactly it felt like rehearsed choreography. Cameron followed at a distance that suggested he'd finally learned something about being useful as sometimes being invisible. They reached the cruiser door and the deputy opened it. The smell of hot plastic and cheap coffee lived inside like a tenant. Lujan didn't ask them to get in, she wanted their faces in the open where the story had to look at them. She took a breath you could see, the kind nurses take before stitches when they know how your skin will think of them later, and she began to write. That was when the cousins made their try. Not all of them. Not the one who had learned to be a father and didn't want his daughter to hear the story about him. Two of the mean ones, the sort who would volunteer violence to feel useful, slid along the edge of the cars, thinking speed and angle were the same as invisibility. One lunged for Ruth's bag. The other went for the tube at Safa's elbow. They were competent stupid, which is the most dangerous kind. Ruth did not scream. She pivoted. She had been a volunteer EMT when most of these men had been boys having opinions about her hips, and put her bag behind her and her shoulder into the first cousin's sternum. He oofed in a way that read family shame more than pain. Safa let the tube go because a tube is easier to chase than a child. Then she didn't chase it. She moved into the space the second cousin left when he lunged and, with both palms, shoved his shoulders just enough that momentum asked him a new question. He tripped backward over the bumper of Cade's truck and sat down hard. The tube rolled under the cruiser, bumped a tire, and stopped, waiting like a sentence whose object was still to be named. Deputy Lujan didn't draw on anyone. She drew herself up and said a single word that worked like a hinge, enough. She'd learned it from a mother who ended fights in the grocery store. It landed better than the sheriff's 3-paragraph explanations. A second deputy, the graveyard shift one whose name no one knew because he didn't write tickets like they were poems, stepped in and took the cousin's wrists in the kind of grip that was not humiliating and was very final. "Guns where I can see them," he said to no one in particular, and 4 men, including the sheriff, remembered they had guns and discovered they wanted the ground to hold them. Out on the road, the water found its historic bed and then, encouraged by the bridge valve's new generosity, found its way into the culvert that ran under Hale and the lane, and then, with the delight of a child discovering a toy in a closet, found the storm drains that had been waiting since 2001 to do something that wasn't metaphor. A cold, bright sheet of river slid along the ditch and lifted the frogs like a congregation. The neighbors made a noise that was not quite applause and not quite a prayer. Kellen took 3 slow steps to Safa. He had no gun in his hands. He had his hat on as if he were going to speak to a preacher. Very softly, so softly that only Safa and Wren and Ruth and the deputy could hear, he said, "You embarrassed me." Safa answered in the same low register, the one you use when trying to talk a horse out of walking into a fence. Then change. His eyes held hers for a long second, and Safa saw what she wanted to see least and most, a thought in there that wasn't just profit. Then it shuddered. He smiled in a way that would photograph well and turned to the crowd. "I applaud citizen initiative," he announced to the ditch like a man running for something. "But given the danger of unregulated water release, we must act with caution. My company stands ready to assist the county in securing the site." "Mr. Roebuck," Deputy Lujan said in a voice that adored neither microphones nor men who liked them, "you are not assisting anything tonight. You are under investigative detention with your hands very visible, and you have the right to be quiet if that's something you remember how to be." The ditch approved with a sound that might have been laughter if it had not been so tired. "Ms. Mayor," the deputy said. "Here's what happens next. I take statements. We collect the recordings. We call in the State Water Board because I won't have my badge on a county report pretending a miracle happened at Hale and it wasn't spelled Roebuck. We get this child seen at the clinic and we don't write her name on any paper the county owns." She paused. "And we figure out how to keep the creek remembering without drowning your kitchen." Safa looked at the water sliding along the ditch. It licked the roots of the front cottonwood and then went on, interested in other things. Her throat tightened so fast it made her eyes sting. She took one careful breath. Another. She had a list in her head: well permit, insurance, the mortgage, the neighbor's inventory of opinions, and they all fell quiet when the old sound of water returned to a valley that had taught itself not to expect it. "Okay," she said. "We'll do it that way." She turned slightly. "Ruth?" Ruth nodded once. "I'll walk with her," she said, meaning Wren. She put a hand on the child's crown, gentle, and then lifted it again as if it weighed too much to keep. "There's more," she said softly to Safa. "We should open the rest of the chest. If I die, someone has to know where the copies are." "You're not dying," Safa said, and made the word a kind of dare to any story planning to argue. They went inside together in the light of so many eyes. It would have been easier to hide. It would have been smarter, maybe, if you listened to the right kind of fear. Safa led them past her kitchen, still warm, still smelling like onions and the last of the tomatoes she had believed were the last, down the hall to the room with the rug pulled back and the plywood set aside. She wanted the neighbors to see her open the lid because that was the only inoculation against the next rumor. She wanted the deputy to see the ladder because that was the only way to turn secrets into infrastructure instead of contraband. She wanted Wren to see the way down as not a coffin but a promise that stairs can also go up. They descended, for shadows on rope. The room welcomed and accused in equal measure. Safa crossed to the chest. The lock had learned her key, and keys get affectionate fast when they're used the way they were made to be. She lifted the lid. The things they had left, the canvas pouch, the metal tube's false bottom, the second packet of letters, looked back without blushing. Safa opened the pouch and poured its contents onto the table. Coins, yes, old silver and older Mexican pieces, but mostly not money, brass tags stamped with meat or cereals, photographs of men standing by a ditch with shovels in their hands and hope on their faces, receipts from the cannery where someone had written "paid with peaches" in a handwriting that must have belonged to a person now dead and remembered exactly anyway. At the bottom, a slim cassette tape labeled in her Hale's neat script, "County File Room, Fire Day." Ruth reached for it like you reach for a child coming down the school steps. "I thought this burned," she whispered. "I thought it was a story I told myself so I could sleep." Safa set the tape by the radio. The radio had been willing to do old magic, perhaps it would try again. She found the tape deck slotted into the base, the sort of redundancy men who love machines build and then forget to brag about because the brag lives in the object. The deck clicked. The tape swallowed itself. The speaker sang the thin, haunted song of a fluorescent-lit room where men talk about things they don't want posterity to hear and fail at secrecy because someone knows where to put a microphone. Voices. The county clerk, younger and meaner. The fire inspector, tired. A third, the same fourth voice from the phone, slicker than both. They talked about files gone missing before the fire that would later be blamed for their disappearance. They named the names of small-town thieves who learned to cash checks with a seal on them. They laughed about how orchards couldn't write their own affidavits. Ruth stood with her eyes closed and listened to a hurt that had not scarred right. Then she opened them and looked at Wren and at Safa in turn. "We don't give this to the county," she said. "We give it to the state and to the paper and to anyone's mother who ever wrote a letter to the editor and saved the carbon." "And to the people in the ditch," Safa said, surprising herself again. "We make them hear it with their own ears, tonight, before the county's morning can call it doctored." Above, the voices had changed shape again. Some of the neighbors had gone to fetch kids from beds, to point out the creek to them like you point out the first snow of their lives. Some had stayed to gather fresh stories by the armful. The sheriff's talk turned into listening. The deputy's pen kept making law. Cameron cleared his throat. "Safa," he said, "the way you talk when your mouth is full of the words you didn't say when you should have. I'm sorry. He made a helpless shape with his hands. For knowing you and not believing you could stay when everything told me you were going to run." She believed him and didn't. Both could be true. "Carry the chest," she said, handing him the one job that would let him say sorry without making a speech of it. He lifted with his legs. She saw the relief on his face as the weight gave him something exact to do. They went back up. The night met them with the sound of water where the dry had been and with the quieter sound of people deciding to stay a little longer. Safa set the cassette player on the porch rail and pressed play. The porch speaker, deficient and perfect, turned the voices into something audible out to the ditch. Ruth stood next to it like a guard. Deputy Lujan crossed her arms and did not smile because it wasn't timed yet. The tape told its story. It was worse and better than anyone wanted. It named nothing spectacular. That was the point. It named ordinary thefts and ordinary voices, the ones that ruin places more than crimes with drama do. When it finished, the night didn't applaud. It adjusted itself. The neighbors looked at each other and tried to find where the mirror was in this scene and where the window was. Kellen made one last attempt at a narrative. "This is old," he began, like a man trying to convince his family at Thanksgiving that the past didn't count because the turkey was dry. "These people are dead. We have to think about the now." "Now," Ruth said, and her voice had a worn religion in it that even the unbelievers leaned into, "is a woman and a child and a farmer and a town choosing to remember whose hands planted things." The deputy looked at Safa and the question she asked was not the one any of the men expected. "You have enough water to finish the well without borrowing from the orchard line?" Safa startled, then nodded. "If the creek's awake," she said, "the shallow veins will hear it. The well won't be just a hole anymore. It'll be a listener." "Then you'll file a permit tomorrow," Lujan said, and the corner of her mouth tried to lift and then remembered where it was. "And you'll sign it in my office, not in the county one, and I'll stamp it so hard the paper will feel married to you. And the county can appeal to a judge who eats peaches from a jar with his morning eggs." "I'll bring him better peaches for next year," Safa said, and the laugh that came out of her was the first one that didn't sound like it belonged to someone she used to be. The scene loosened the way crowds do when the work of a night moves from decision to the first tasks you can do with your hands. People began to walk home in twos. A boy carried a frog in his cupped palms toward the now chattering ditch, whispering apologies to it for the dry years like it would translate them to its cousins. The cousins in cuffs got put into cars without drama. The sheriff wrote something down that might not be a lie. Cade stared at the creek like a man trying to calculate how to bill it. Kellen stood motionless for a long while, then put his hat back on and left without swagger. The night preferred him small. Ruth turned to go, then stopped and set her palm on the porch post. He would have liked tonight, she said, our hail unspoken but present. Not the fight. The math. He liked when people proved the land still remembered them, Safa said, understanding it like a chord struck true and resonant through bone. Wren tugged Safa's shirt hem twice, their signal. Can the box sleep open? She asked. Yes, Safa said. And if it wants a new name, we'll give it one. She crouched to be level with the child and the world and hugged her, not careful. Wren's arms came around her neck like the first string you tune on a guitar that's been in a closet too long and somehow is still near enough to true that you feel spoiled for a second. Under the poplars, the air smelled the way it used to at the end of summer when the cannery ran until the street lamps cut their faces into slices and the workers made jokes with their backs because their mouths were tired. Safa looked at her house, at the room where Dud had died, at the yard where a lid had become a hinge. Fear, which had been a constant quiet roommate for months, sat down on the steps and fell asleep without her permission. Through the deep part of the night, the water kept sliding along the old grammar. Safa and Ruth and Deputy Lujan took turns telling the next people who arrived what the story was before the county could. Cameron carried coffee out to the ditch and did not ask if anyone wanted it, he handed it to the person who had been standing the longest. Wren, kissed on the forehead 3 too many times by women who knew better than to ask permission first, finally fell asleep across 2 chairs with a blanket that smelled like Safa's laundry. Toward dawn, the river and the night made a truce. The sirens did not come back. The frogs said their last profane things and went to bed. A coyote coughed and then thought better of weighing in. The sun thumbed gray at the edge of everything and then took itself seriously. Harlan's truck pulled in around 6, because men like Harlan show up when work has been promised and coffee is possible. He parked, saw the cruisers, and stood for a second with his hands on his hips doing the arithmetic of how much trouble a person could choose. Then he walked to the porch and nodded to Ruth, to Lujan, to Safa, to Wren asleep and not hiding. He said nothing until he had said nothing long enough for it to count as respect. You want me to finish the trench? He asked. Yes, Safa said, and realized the word made her body feel more like a house than it had in months. We got water to meet. He nodded once. Good, he said. I was getting tired of dirt acting like it doesn't owe us a conversation. By midday, the county sent someone who knew how to be ashamed properly. Papers shifted their weight in Ruth's bag and in Deputy Lujan's hand. The state board called back. Kellen had a lawyer call and say words that sounded like weather but meant he would be quiet for a while. Safa and Harlan set the pump in the mouth and asked it to learn the land's language. The motor hummed without complaint. The hose made a long, quiet arc to the tank pad as if finishing a sentence Dud Mir had started with his boots. When the water finally came at the spigot by the kitchen sink, with a sigh like a girl's relieved breath, it tasted of creek and iron and a kind of clean you don't get from town plastic. Wren stood on a chair to reach the tap and cupped her hands and drank and then looked at Safa like someone had told her a secret and it turned out to be exactly hers. It's cold, she said, bright-eyed with the obvious. That's because it was sleeping, Safa said. We woke it up nice. That evening, after a day so long Safa's bones felt pleasantly wrung out, she took the metal tube and the ledger and the cassette to the library in town. She insisted the librarian, Mrs. Ortega, who had watched 100 teenagers kiss in the history stacks and pretended not to, scan and copy and email and send and print until each thing existed everywhere a person could reasonably hide it in a small town. Mrs. Ortega did it with the focused fury of a woman whose mother had been cheated out of water in '78 and still lived to tell the story correctly. On the way home, Safa drove by the cannery. The loading dock looked like what it always had been, the place where work quits and talk begins. She saw a boy there with a frog in a jar and a woman next to him explaining biodiversity like it were a recipe. She let herself have the ridiculous, needed thought that maybe tomorrow the boy would hear the word riparian and feel about it the way other boys felt about the word horsepower. She stopped at the bridge. The water there wasn't much, a slick tongue off to one side whispering to cattails. But it moved, and it meant it. She stood with her hands in the rail's rust and listened. In the cloth of the sound she could hear other new sounds she wanted to live long enough to learn, a kid practicing trumpet on a porch for a school band that would be better than last year's, a night when the frogs were so loud the sheriff had to roll up his windows to answer his phone, a harvest in a field that had been brown too long forgetting it knew other colors. In the morning of the second day, Ruth brought over a box of jars with labels that hadn't been smug in a long time. "Peaches," she said, holding one up to the window so it turned part of Safa's kitchen into amber. "For when people come asking for more than a tour. It helps to feed the helpers." Deputy Lujan came back with forms and a tired smile and an envelope from the state. Inside, a letter that said, in that particular state way, "We heard the county tried to say miracle, we prefer evidence." It referenced the cassette, the cam footage, the ledger. It used the word injunction in a way that sounded like the first stone you lay when you start a wall. That night, Ruth arrived after sundown with a worry that wasn't about water. She stood at Safa's sink like it was her own and washed her hands the way women do when they need the world to keep its places while they talk. "They'll try to retaliate," she said. "Not publicly. Not with law. With the cats. With the kids. With the petty." Safa nodded. "So we make pettiness expensive," she said. "We tell stories so loudly that anybody who breaks a window will be famous for exactly the wrong thing. We turn cameras into town crows. We teach Ren the number for the deputy's personal phone. We agree that if someone goes missing for 4 hours, that's too long to call it teenage." Ruth looked at her for a long time like she was comparing a photograph of Safa in her head to the woman in front of her now. "Dud picked right," she said finally. "Sometimes," Safa said, "it feels like he picked hunger and let it pick me back." She turned the jar of peaches in her hands. "But I know what to do with hunger." They walked out to the yard together to check the lid, not because it needed checking but because ritual turns fear into something your hands can do. The night was ordinary, grasshoppers, a far dog, the hum of Harlan's truck driving past with the radio playing a song that had outlived 4 formats. Ren came in from the porch with a book she had adopted in a habit now of leaving doors open without fear. She paused at the lid and patted it like you pat a good horse on the flank when you say goodnight to it. "Can I sleep down there sometimes?" she asked, a child's question, plain and heavy. "Only when you want to remember," Safa said. "Not when you're afraid." On the third morning, Safa walked to the mailbox and found 3 letters. One from the bank, dried blood on paper pretending to be official. She smiled because she knew the deputy now and the state now and the name of the judge who liked peaches. One from a woman in town who had not spoken to her since Safa wore eyeliner to 9th grade, a thank you for the water and a pumpkin bread recipe that had survived 2 marriages. And one that stopped her on the spot, no return address, writing careful and unpracticed, like someone had asked their hand to behave and the hand had agreed only this once. "Thank you for the girl," it said. She ran from the shed and didn't look back. "We can't come forward yet because he's still who he is, but we heard the tape. We're gathering. Keep the lid open." Safa folded the letter into the ledger. Some histories belong together. She set coffee water on the stove and let the kettle make its old promises. The sink gurgled softly in a new, friendly way. As the season turned, the orchard did something petty and beautiful. It put out a few late blossoms on 2 trees that had no business offering anything. Ruth stood under them and shook her head. "Show-offs," she said. They heard. The county sued. The state answered. Kellen gave 2 interviews where he said the word safety 5 times and community 6, which is how you tell a man is scared. Cade left for 3 weeks and came back thinner, which meant someone had fired him and someone else had hired him to do the same work with a new shirt. The sheriff lost the election he had already planned to win and ran a bait shop for 6 months before admitting he liked it more. Deputy Lujan became Sheriff Lujan because sometimes the right math wins slow. The first thing she did was make sure the magnet seals got thrown in a dumpster, and then she changed the locks to something you couldn't buy at a hardware store with a smile and an old grudge. As for Safa, she learned the daily muscle of peace. She learned where the pump wanted finesse and where it wanted force. She learned how to tell the difference between a pipe that complains and a pipe that warns. She learned Wren's laughter and the way it turned the kitchen from a place where hunger waited into a place where hunger understood it at competition. She learned that Ruth Hale makes coffee the way field medics do, stronger than your problems, warmer than your hate. She learned that Cameron could sit on a porch and not fill silence with apology when apology had finished its shift. And on a Wednesday morning with the kind of blue sky that would be a cliché if you didn't earn it, Harlan called from the yard, "Ms. Muir? You want to do the honor?" She went, wiping her hands on her jeans out of habit she didn't plan to break. He stood by the well, the pump steady, the water rising in the line. The trench was backfilled. The tank sat patient as a new heart. The faucet at the yard spigot was closed. He opened it. Water came. Not with fanfare. With a certainty that made fanfare look like an apology for not being real. It hit the bucket and turned it from metal into music. Safa stood very still and cried without embarrassment because girls who grow into women who lift things are allowed to cry when the thing they've been trying to lift finally lifts itself. Wren hooped and spun in a circle and then, when she saw Safa crying, came and pressed her face into Safa's side the way kids do when the world is finally the right size again. Ruth clapped one clean, decisive clap the way midwives do when a baby coughs and then yells properly. Safa dipped her hands and drank. The cold leapt to her teeth and told them the truth. She turned and threw her arms around Harlan in a hug that surprised them both. He patted her back like he was tamping down gravel and said gruffly, "We'll see about the irrigation next." "Tomorrow," she said, and liked how the word felt. That night, at the cannery, there was a meeting that didn't call itself a meeting. People brought folding chairs and jars of peaches and loaves of bread and a stereo that worked if you slapped it. Mrs. Ortega ran a cord off the generator and made the tape tell its story again, not because people didn't believe it the first time but because repetition is how small towns build levees against lies. The kids played tag between the forklifts. Someone sang. Someone else laughed for the first time and stopped in the middle to make sure laughing still worked. Safa stood near the door and watched them come, neighbors who had never looked her in the eye, a man from the state who left his tie in his car, two field hands who looked like they'd been told their whole lives to stand at the back and did not, a woman with purple hair whose grandmother had worked the line in '74 and still had shoulders like a person who lifted heavy boxes without making a show of it. Wren leaned against the jamb and counted shoes, a game she had made to calm herself once and now played for pleasure. When it was time to speak, Ruth spoke. Then Deputy Luan. Then Mrs. Ortega. Then, unbelievably, Cameron stood and said two sentences that were exactly as long as he was honest. They let Safa be last. She told the story without dressing it up because dirt and water have always hated makeup. She ended with a simple invitation: if you want to shift watching the lid, add your name to the sheet. If you want to help with the pipe fence, bring gloves at 8. If you want to teach Wren algebra because I never learned it right, come over after dinner and we'll trade bread for lessons. People came. They brought names. A list grew, the kind of list places save in drawers and read at funerals and picnics. The water slid along the ditch outside like it had nowhere else to be and was glad of it. Later, after words and bread and the strange exhausted cheer that follows a day that could have gone a different way and didn't, Safa walked home with Wren asleep on her shoulder and Ruth telling a story about a spring flood in '83 that had lifted an entire rowboat out of a barn and set it down in the middle of Main Street like punctuation. The night smelled of wet dust and something green beginning. They stopped by the bridge. The moon had come up, wearing a halo like someone embarrassed about being this beautiful. The water was nothing that would move a county alderman to tears. It was enough to move Safa. She set Wren down and the girl woke and looked at the current and said, "Practical, it will bring frogs." "Yes," Safa said. "And mistakes. And fish that disapprove of us. And boys who will throw rocks at the wrong time and apologize later." She took the flat key from her pocket and slid it along the railing, feeling its wrongness like a talisman. It will bring everything a place needs to feel like it can keep telling the truth. Wren slid her hand into Safa's. "And if the men come back?" "We'll be here," Safa said. "With more of us." With better stories and more names. She squeezed. With you. A car slowed on the bridge, Kellen's. He rolled his window down and looked at them in the water and the key glinting like an argument. He nodded once, a millimeter of a thing. It wasn't surrender. It was an apology. It was the first honest math he'd done in a while. Then he drove on. Safa tipped her head back and felt the strain ease in the bones of her neck. She thought of Dud. She thought of our Hale. She thought of the men at the county who had built their houses on files that didn't exist anymore. She thought of the old sound of a shovel hitting a lid and of the new sound of a creek learning itself again, and she thought, fiercely and without shame, I live here. In the days that followed, the lid in her yard became a place instead of a problem. Kids came by to look at it like an exhibit, and Ruth made them leave their gum on their tongues. The clipboard by the porch filled with names, then a second page, then a third. Someone painted the round iron in a color that was neither pretty nor official, and everyone agreed it was right. The ledger lived in a glass case at the library. The tape lived on the internet and in 6 freezers and in people's pockets, which is where the most dangerous things always live in a small town. On an afternoon in late fall, Wren ran in from the orchard with a letter in her hand and dirt on her knees. For you, she said, breathless, and put the envelope on the table like a bird she had caught by asking nicely. Inside was a photocopy of a deed from 1912, Hale and Mere to town, easement, perpetual, in case of drought. It smelled like the library and starch. It read like permission. It felt like a grandfather shaking your hand and passing you a tool he had sharpened for you without telling you. Safa put the copy on the wall by the calendar where she would have to look at it when her hope forgot its memorized lines. She stood a long time simply looking. Then she turned to Wren and said, homework, and Wren rolled her eyes and got out the algebra book and the bread in exchange for it. When winter came, the creek slowed, not to die but to concentrate. Ice drew its fine calligraphy along the shallow edges. The lid wore frost like a lace cap. The town fell into a new kind of quiet, the good kind, the kind that wraps instead of strangling. Safa bought a new pump motor in cash and did not apologize to the bank for doing a thing the honest way. Deputy Lujan sent a card with a golden badge sticker on it to Wren that said, simply, you are seen. Kellen mailed a check to the library and did not sign it, but everyone knew his handwriting, and that was enough to make people argue about whether redemption required witnesses. On the first warm day of spring, Safa opened the lid to air the room and sat on the top rung of the ladder with her feet swinging in red letters aloud to the dark like the dark needed stories, too. Wren painted the false wall a clean white and declared that you could hide here now and not feel sad about it. Ruth wrote a list on the table of seedlings people had promised and seeds the library would lend. Cameron, who had learned to leave and return like a person who had finally learned the difference between love and rescue, planted 2 poplars on the back fence and didn't carve their initials anywhere because some things are better if you let them forget who planted them. When strangers came by asking where the well was that had rung like a bell, Safa took them to it and told them the useful parts. She did not give them the ledger. She did not give them the key. She gave them the recipe for bread if they looked hungry and the number for the deputy if they looked like paperwork trying to look like a person. And on a night when the frogs were so loud the ditch sounded like 1,000 small, happy arguments, she stood on her porch and said thank you in the direction of 3 graves and 2 living women and a child asleep with a book on her face. The creek answered with its busy little sermon. The wind ran its hands through the poplars. The lid lay closed and unconcerned. The house settled around her like a body that had finally decided it didn't have to flinch at every sound. She went inside and wrote 1 sentence on an index card and taped it above the kitchen sink, beside the one from the chest. In her neat, stubborn hand, if you take this, you promise to share it. That was the shape of the ordinary miracle. Not the flood, not the siren, not the tape or the ledger or the map. It was a woman who had decided to stay and to turn a hole in her yard into a door other people could use without asking her permission every time they needed to be safe. In a valley that had learned to be thirsty, that counted as rain. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.